The elevator paradox. You press the elevator button, wait a moment, and the doors slide open. Strangely, there's already someone inside. Oddly enough, it feels like this happens almost every time. The elevator always seems to be coming from above, rarely from below. At first glance, it doesn't seem like a big deal. But hidden in this everyday experience is a subtle and fascinating paradox, first pointed out by physicist George Gamow, known as the elevator paradox. On the surface, it seems like elevators should arrive from below just as often as they come from above, especially if they're moving freely between floors and stopping as needed. But that's not what we typically experience. The trick lies in how elevators behave in busy buildings. Picture a tall skyscraper with dozens of floors. Most people gather on the lower levels, lobbies, offices, cafes, and food courts, where foot traffic is highest. That means most elevator trips start on the lower floors and head upward. As a result, elevators spend more of their time moving up from the bottom, and consequently, they spend more time on the upper floors since they're constantly being called from below. Here's where things get counterintuitive. Because elevators linger more on higher floors, they're more likely to be on their way down when you press the button. This creates the illusion that elevators almost always arrive from above, even though we might expect a 50-50 split. This same kind of statistical quirk appears in other places too. Think of a bus stop where buses are scheduled every 10 minutes. In theory, your wait time should average around 5 minutes. But in reality, delays happen, and you're more likely to be waiting during a long gap between buses rather than a short one. The same goes for elevators. The longer an elevator stays on higher floors, the more likely it is that you'll catch it coming down. The elevator paradox is a perfect reminder that our perception doesn't always match up with probability. What feels like an annoying quirk of modern life is actually a hidden rule of statistical physics at work. So, the next time you find yourself stepping into it. The raven paradox. A black raven perches silently on a fence post. A scientist nearby nods thoughtfully and jots something in his notebook. It seems like an ordinary moment, but it's actually a window into one of the strangest paradoxes in logic and the philosophy of science, the raven paradox. At first glance, the idea seems simple. Take the statement, all ravens are black. It feels reasonable, backed by our everyday observations. We confirm it, so we think, by using inductive reasoning. Each black raven we see adds more support to the claim. But this is where things start to get weird. In the 1940s, philosopher Carl Gustav Hempel pointed out a strange implication of how confirmation works in logic. It begins with a basic principle. If a statement is true, then anything that contradicts it must be false. So, if all ravens are black is true, then its logical equivalent must also be true. Everything that is not black is not a raven. At first, that sounds harmless. But here comes the paradox. Imagine a green apple. It's not black, and it's not a raven. According to formal logic, this green apple confirms the statement that all ravens are black. Yes, you read that right. By observing a green apple, logic says you're gathering evidence that supports the idea that all ravens are black. In fact, every non-black, non-raven thing you see, a red chair, a blue book, a yellow sunflower, each of them adds confirmation to the claim. Absurd, right? After all, a green apple seems to have nothing to do with ravens. And yet, according to the strict rules of logic, it contributes to the same conclusion. The issue isn't with the logic, it's with where that logic takes us. If this were how confirmation worked, a scientist could try to prove all ravens are black without looking at a single raven. They could just catalog non-black, non-raven objects and claim indirect proof. This is what makes it a paradox. It follows the rules of reasoning, but it clashes with common sense. The raven paradox exposes a deeper question about science itself. How do we define evidence? In practice, we tend to value observations that are directly relevant to what we're testing. If you want to confirm that all swans are white, you observe swans, not bricks or pine cones. But the paradox forces us to ask, should logic always overrule intuition? Or does our sense of what's relevant actually matter? Philosophers have proposed various solutions. Some say the green apple really does count as evidence, just very weak evidence. Others argue that the paradox reveals flaws in our assumptions about confirmation, suggesting that real-world science doesn't always align with rigid logic. Either way, the raven paradox remains a fascinating unsettling puzzle. It reminds us that even a simple idea, all ravens are black, can spiral into contradiction under the microscope of reason. And so, as the scientist watches the black raven take flight, he's left wondering, what is truth, if even a green apple can confirm it? The preface paradox. An author stands before an eager crowd at a book signing, smiling as they hold up their latest work, a carefully researched, meticulously edited book filled with facts, arguments, and conclusions. Every claim has been double-checked, every assertion backed by evidence. And yet, in the book's preface, the author humbly admits, despite my best efforts, there are almost certainly some mistakes in this book. This single sentence introduces a paradox, one that may seem trivial at first, but reveals a deep contradiction in how we reason. The paradox begins with a simple observation. If the author truly believes every individual statement in the book, then they must believe the book is entirely correct. But if they also believe that mistakes are inevitable, they must also believe that at least some statements are false. How can both beliefs be held at once? At the heart of the preface paradox lies a challenge to our understanding of rational belief and knowledge itself. To unpack it, consider what it means to believe something. Rational thinkers aim to hold only justified, well-supported beliefs. If the author has done their due diligence, then they should believe each claim they've written. Otherwise, including it would be dishonest. Yet, past experience tells us that even the most rigorously written works contain errors. No book is flawless, no argument perfectly airtight. The author's general knowledge affirms that human error is unavoidable. The paradox arises because these two beliefs, believing every individual claim and believing that some claims must be mistaken, appear logically incompatible. The obvious solution might be to say the author doesn't believe each statement with absolute certainty, but rather holds them with high confidence. However, this only shifts the problem. If rationality demands that we match our level of belief to the strength of the evidence, then we should never be entirely certain about anything. Still, in practice, we often behave as though we are. We assert facts, make arguments, and take positions with conviction. The paradox highlights a subtle tension between intellectual humility and epistemic commitment. One proposed resolution involves distinguishing between local and global reasoning. The author believes each individual statement based on specific, localized evidence. But their belief that there must be some mistakes is not tied to any single statement. It's a meta-belief about the book as a whole, informed by the general fallibility of human reasoning. In this view, the contradiction dissolves. Each individual belief is rational on its own merits, while the broader recognition of possible error operates at a different level of thought. Still, this resolution doesn't satisfy everyone. It raises a deeper concern. If we always admit the possibility that some of our beliefs are wrong, how can we ever claim certainty about anything? If even the most rigorous thinkers accept the inevitability of error, does that mean all human knowledge is ultimately uncertain? The preface paradox serves as a powerful reminder that rational belief is more complex than it appears. It forces us to navigate the delicate balance between confidence and humility, certainty and skepticism. And so, as the author signs another copy and hands it to a reader, a quiet thought lingers. Is there a mistake on this very page? The friendship paradox. We like to think of our social lives as fairly balanced. Some people have wide circles of friends, others prefer a quieter life. But on average, we assume most people have a typical social experience. Beneath that assumption, however, lies a surprising mathematical truth that warps our perception of connection, the friendship paradox. Once you understand it, you can't unsee it. It begins with a simple, counterintuitive idea. On average, your friends have more friends than you do. That sounds impossible. After all, friendship is mutual. If you're friends with someone, they're friends with you too. Shouldn't friendships be evenly distributed? But if you actually looked through your list of friends and checked how many friends each of them has, you'd likely find that most are more socially connected than you. So how can this be? The answer lies in the structure of social networks. People with many friends are more likely to appear in your social circle than people with few. The more connected someone is, the more likely it is that you know them. A person with 500 friends shows up in far more people's networks than someone with only 5. So statistically, your social world is populated more by the highly connected than by the average. Imagine a crowded party. The host, who knows almost everyone, is visible to nearly all attendees. Meanwhile, a quiet guest in the corner, who knows just a few people, might go unnoticed. Social visibility is unevenly distributed, and this skews our perception. It makes it feel like everyone around you is more popular, more outgoing, and more socially active than you are. And the effects of the friendship paradox go far beyond just friendships. In professional networks, online platforms, and social media, the same bias holds. We mostly see celebrities, influencers, and creators with massive followings. Even if the average user has only a few followers, their feed is filled with people who have thousands, even millions. The result? It feels like everyone is more popular than you, even when that's statistically false. This phenomenon has real-world consequences. In epidemiology, for example, diseases spread faster through well-connected individuals. If an illness enters a network, it's more likely to pass through those with the most connections. That makes it seem like everyone is getting sick before it even reaches you. In economics, the same pattern emerges. Wealthier people often have broader social and professional circles. As a result, they appear more frequently in others' lives, making it seem like everyone is doing better financially than you are. Again, not because most people are rich, but because the rich are more visible. Even in politics and culture, highly connected voices dominate. When ideas spread through influential individuals, it can seem like everyone holds a certain belief or supports a trend. But that perception may only exist because the loudest, most connected people are repeating it, not because it's universally accepted. The friendship paradox invites us to question how we see the world around us. It reminds us that our perspective is shaped by the structure of our social networks, and that the people we encounter most often aren't necessarily representative of the majority. So if you ever feel less connected, less popular, or less influential than everyone around you, remember, it might not be a personal shortcoming. It might just be a mathematical illusion. The Berry paradox. Language has the power to explain the world in ways that make sense, but sometimes words turn on themselves, creating contradictions that shouldn't exist. A sentence can follow all the rules of logic, yet lead to an impossible conclusion. The Berry paradox is one of these traps, a paradox that arises not from numbers, time loops, or quantum mechanics, but from the very structure of language itself. It begins with a simple definition: the smallest number that cannot be defined in fewer than 12 words. At first, this seems reasonable. Some numbers, like 1 or 7, can be described with a single word. Others, like 100 or 1000, require two. As numbers grow larger and more complex, it makes sense that more than 12 words might be needed to define them. There must be a point where a number can't be fully described without exceeding the 12-word limit. But here's the problem: we just defined it. The smallest number that can't be defined in fewer than 12 words is itself a description under 12 words long. This creates a paradox. This number is simultaneously undefinable within 12 words and yet defined within 12 words. A contradiction that shouldn't be possible. The moment we attempt to capture this boundary precisely, language collapses, leaving us with a paradox. The Berry paradox was first proposed by mathematician Golub Fraga, but it was later named by Bertrand Russell, who gave it its famous title after a librarian named G.G. Berry, who pointed out the linguistic issue. Russell, already grappling with logical paradoxes in mathematics, saw something deeper in it: a flaw in the way we use language to describe complex concepts. This paradox reveals something unsettling about human language. We assume that words have precise meanings, that definitions create clear boundaries between what something is and what it is not. Yet the Berry paradox exposes a hidden flaw. Sometimes our definitions create feedback loops that collapse meaning entirely. The phrase, "not definable in fewer than 12 words," loses its meaning the moment we successfully define something using it. It gets even stranger when we extend the logic further. If we can create a paradox by manipulating definitions, how many of our everyday statements contain hidden contradictions? How many of the concepts we rely on, numbers, identity, even knowledge, are built on linguistic shortcuts that might unravel under scrutiny? Some have argued that the Berry paradox isn't a true paradox at all, but merely an illusion created by vague language. Perhaps the problem isn't in the definition itself, but in how we treat self-referential statements as though they can be precise. Others believe it points to something deeper, a limit to logic itself, where no system of reasoning, no matter how carefully constructed, can completely avoid contradictions. Either way, the Berry paradox serves as a reminder. It challenges us to question the words we rely on and to recognize that language is not perfect. Even the most careful definitions can lead us into impossible loops. It reminds us that sometimes the very act of defining something is what makes it undefinable. The St. Petersburg paradox. To understand the St. Petersburg paradox, imagine a game that is simple enough for anyone to play, yet paradoxical enough to challenge our understanding of value, probability, and rational decision-making. In this game, the potential winnings can stretch into infinity, yet the cost to play seems remarkably small. On paper, the game suggests you should bet everything you have, but in reality, most people wouldn't risk even a few dollars. This is the essence of the St. Petersburg paradox, a thought experiment that exposes the fragile relationship between mathematical expectation and human intuition. The game starts with a coin toss. You pay a fixed entry fee, say $10. If the coin lands on heads, the game ends, and you win $2. If it lands on tails, the coin is tossed again. If it lands heads on the second toss, you win $4. If tails appears again, the process continues, with the potential payout doubling each time. $8, $16, $32, $64, and so on, heading toward infinity. At first glance, the expected value of the game, the amount a rational person should be willing to pay, seems infinite. The reasoning is straightforward. There's a 50% chance of winning $2, a 25% chance of winning $4, a 12.5% chance of winning $8, and so on. Mathematically, when you sum all these possibilities, the expected payout diverges to infinity. This implies that if people were purely rational and based their decisions solely on probability theory, they should be willing to pay any amount to play this game. $100, $000, $1 million, or even their entire fortune. The expected value suggests that it would be worth it. But here's the paradox. Almost no one would actually do this. In reality, most people wouldn't pay $20 for a chance to play, let alone risk everything they own. So where does the contradiction lie? If math says one thing, but human behavior says another, what does that reveal about our understanding of value and rationality? The St. Petersburg paradox was first proposed in 1713 by Swiss mathematician Daniel Bernoulli, who saw it as exposing a flaw in traditional probability theory's approach to calculating value. Bernoulli argued that the problem wasn't with the numbers themselves, but in how people perceive those numbers. He introduced the concept of diminishing marginal utility, the idea that as wealth increases, each additional dollar becomes less valuable. For example, for a billionaire, an additional $11,000 might not change their life, but for a struggling worker, $1,000 might cover rent, groceries, or medical bills. This explains why people don't value money linearly. The difference between $2 and $4 feels more significant than the difference between $1 million and $2 million. This insight led to the development of expected utility theory, which suggests that people maximize their perceived benefits rather than just raw probabilities. However, even this adjustment doesn't fully solve the paradox. Because the St. Petersburg game involves potentially infinite rewards, no matter how much you account for diminishing returns, the expected value still trends toward infinity. Even modern decision theory struggles to explain why rational people refuse to pay large amounts to play. So, what can we infer from this? Some argue that the paradox exposes a fundamental flaw in probability theory itself, that real-world decisions can't be based solely on mathematical expectations. Others believe it demonstrates that humans are not wired to think rationally when it comes to probability and risk. Finally, there's a deeper philosophical question. If we can't rely on mathematical expectation to guide our choices, what should we trust instead? The St. Petersburg paradox might seem like an odd betting game, but its implications extend far beyond gambling. It highlights the disconnect between logic and intuition, theory and reality, and, perhaps most disturbingly, it suggests that the numbers we use to model the world, even in the most objective mathematical sense, might not be as reliable as we think. The coin paradox. It's like a trap, waiting the moment you step into it. a sentence that curls in on itself, like a snake devouring its own tail. At first, it seems understandable, but the more you ponder it, the stranger it becomes. The Quine paradox is one of these linguistic black holes, a paradox that challenges our very understanding of self-reference and definition. It's a statement that refuses to be pinned down, questioning the meaning of existence itself by simply existing. At first glance, it seems innocuous enough. The Quine paradox, named after philosopher and logician Willard Van Orman Quine, revolves around a sentence that defines itself in a way that disrupts language. Imagine a sentence that reads, "This sentence is false when preceded by its own quotation." That's the whole thing. But now, let's think about it seriously. What happens if you try to complete it? If you were to quote the sentence and place it before itself, you'd get something like, "This sentence is false when preceded by its own quotation." Now, try to analyze it. If this statement is true, then it must be false, because that's what it says. But if it's false, that means it must be true. It's a perfect loop, a sentence that seems to say something, but never resolves into anything meaningful. This is where the Quine paradox diverges from other self-referential paradoxes, like the classic liar paradox, where someone says, "I am lying." The liar paradox creates an infinite loop between truth and falsehood, but the Quine paradox goes beyond mere contradiction. It's about the very breakdown of definition itself. The moment you attempt to define the sentence, it slips away like water in your hands. To make things even stranger, this paradox isn't just an abstract curiosity. It has profound implications in logic, philosophy, and even computer science. At its core, the Quine paradox shows how language can be structured in ways that defy conventional meaning. Sentences are meant to communicate something, to point to truth or falsehood, but this one refuses to do either. It builds its meaning out of its own existence, making it both the subject and the object of its own definition. In logic and mathematics, paradoxes like this challenge the foundations of formal systems. They suggest that self-reference can create statements that cannot be evaluated as true or false. This is a serious issue because much of logic relies on being able to classify statements clearly. When you introduce a statement that can't be resolved, you create a logical black hole, something that defies categorization and breaks the rules. You might wonder if this matters outside of philosophy. The answer is yes, especially in computer science. Self-referential statements like the Quine paradox are directly tied to issues of recursion and self-replicating programs. In fact, a Quine in programming refers to a piece of code that, when run, outputs its own source code. This is a practical example of the same strange logic, information defining itself without external input. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the Quine paradox is how it makes us reconsider the nature of our own thinking. We rely on language to make sense of reality. We assume that words and sentences exist to communicate meaning. But what if a sentence simply exists to describe itself? What if meaning collapses the moment we try to grasp it? It's unsettling to think about a sentence that doesn't convey anything except that it exists, a statement that resists definition because its definition is its own structure. And yet, we continue to try to define it. So, the next time you encounter something that seems profound, ask yourself, does it truly have meaning, or is it merely a linguistic trick, looping forever in its own reflection? Perhaps the Quine paradox isn't just a linguistic issue, but a mirror reflecting the limits of our own understanding. The Grelling-Nelson paradox. Language is meant to help us make sense of the world. It categorizes, defines, and structures reality, turning the chaos of existence into something we can describe and understand. But what if language itself is a trap? What if hidden within its rules is a paradox so deep that it shatters the very logic it was designed to organize? This is the Grelling-Nelson paradox, a problem that emerges when words start to turn against themselves. Picture dividing all adjectives into two categories, autological words and heterological words. Autological words describe themselves. For example, short is a short word, English is an English word, and polysyllabic has multiple syllables. Heterological words, on the other hand, do not describe themselves. For instance, long is not a long word, French is not a French word, and monosyllabic has more than one syllable. This seems straightforward, just a clever way to classify words. But then comes the question that unravels everything. Is the word heterological itself heterological? If heterological is autological, it must describe itself. But then it would have to be heterological, creating a contradiction. If heterological is heterological, it must not describe itself. But since being heterological means not describing itself, it must be autological again. A paradox. There's no escape. The moment you attempt to categorize the word, logic collapses. Language, the very system we rely on for clarity, becomes an impossible loop. The Grelling-Nelson paradox isn't just a quirky linguistic puzzle. It reveals a deep instability in how we define things. Words are meant to carry meaning, but what happens when a word tries to define itself? The paradox suggests that some concepts simply cannot be consistently categorized, no matter how precise the rules may seem. This paradox echoes broader issues in logic and mathematics. Bertrand Russell's famous paradox, known as Russell's paradox, asks whether the set of all sets that do not contain themselves contains itself. If it does, it must not. If it doesn't, it must. The Grelling-Nelson paradox takes this contradiction and applies it to language, showing that even words, when examined closely, can lead to unsolvable dilemmas. But the implications stretch even further. If some words defy classification, what does that say about language as a whole? Could it mean that certain truths about the world are inherently beyond definition? Is it possible that some ideas exist outside the scope of human thought simply because our language can't capture them? Philosophers and logicians have debated whether paradoxes like these highlight flaws in human reasoning or if they are simply a byproduct of the systems we create for classification. Some have tried to resolve the Grelling-Nelson paradox by claiming that certain words shouldn't even be considered valid adjectives in the first place, sidestepping the problem rather than solving it. Yet, this approach feels unsatisfying. It suggests that contradictions in logic should be ignored rather than understood. In a way, this paradox mirrors the challenges of self-awareness and self-reference. Just as language struggles when a word tries to describe itself, do we struggle when we try to understand our own existence? When we ask, "What am I?" or "What is consciousness?" are we encountering the same paradox, where the act of defining something alters the thing being defined? The Grelling-Nelson paradox reminds us that some questions might never have satisfying answers, not because we lack intelligence, but because language itself might be an imperfect tool for understanding reality. And if that's true, then perhaps the greatest paradox of all is this: can we ever truly know what we cannot express? The unexpected exam paradox. A teacher announces to their class that there will be a surprise exam next week, but they won't know which day it will occur until the moment it begins. The students, eager to outsmart the situation, begin to analyze the claim. If the exam were to take place on Friday, the last possible day, they would know by Thursday night that it must happen the next day, making it no longer a surprise. So, Friday is ruled out as an option. Now, if Friday is impossible, Thursday must be the latest day the exam can occur. But on Wednesday night, realizing the exam hasn't happened yet, and that Friday is ruled out, the students would conclude that the exam must take place on Thursday. This reasoning eliminates Thursday too, as it would no longer be a surprise. By continuing this logic backward, the students eliminate every possible day. They conclude the exam cannot be a surprise on Friday, Thursday, Wednesday, Tuesday, or even Monday. The paradox seems to lead to one logical conclusion: the exam cannot happen at all. Yet, on the designated day, the teacher hands out the exam, and the students are completely caught off guard. Despite the students' seemingly flawless reasoning, the exam happens. This contradiction is at the heart of the unexpected exam paradox, also known as the surprise examination paradox. This paradox shatters our assumptions about logic, prediction, and knowledge. It plays with the idea of self-reference. The students' reasoning about the exam influences the very thing they are trying to predict. They assume that if they can logically figure out when the exam will occur, then it can't be a surprise. However, their reasoning collapses because it only works if the exam doesn't happen before they've completed their deductions. The unexpected exam paradox extends beyond a simple thought experiment. It reveals a flaw in how we apply logic to uncertain situations. The students assume that their understanding of the rules allows them to predict the future with certainty. But what if the act of thinking itself introduces an unavoidable blind spot? The paradox suggests that logical reasoning may sometimes prevent us from accepting reality, even when it is inevitable. The student's airtight logic stops them from considering the possibility of a surprise exam, only for their expectations to be completely overturned. This is similar to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which show that even in the most rigorous logical systems, there will always be truths that cannot be proven within the system itself. Just as the student's reasoning appears flawless but ultimately fails, our mathematical and philosophical structures may contain hidden contradictions, where certainty crumbles into paradox. But the implications extend even further. The paradox is not just about surprises. It highlights how predictions can be self-defeating. If we believe that the future is entirely determined by logic, we might overlook the ways reality disrupts our expectations. It raises an unsettling possibility. Perhaps there are limits to what can be known, not because of insufficient evidence, but because of the very nature of knowledge itself. Consider how this paradox might apply to real life. Could a military strategist, a stock trader, or even a scientist fall into the same trap, believing they have ruled out all possibilities, only to be blindsided by the very event they dismissed? Could our ability to anticipate success or disaster be fundamentally constrained by the fact that our predictions influence the very system we are trying to predict? The unexpected exam paradox forces us to question whether certainty is always attainable. If logic itself can lead us into a blind alley, what does that say about our ability to predict anything with confidence? Perhaps some things remain unknowable, not because they are too complex, but because knowledge itself cannot always be perfectly self-contained. In essence, the unexpected exam paradox is more than a riddle. It serves as a reminder that reality doesn't always adhere to the limits of human reasoning. In the grander scheme of things, the biggest surprises may be the ones we never saw coming. The causal horizon paradox. There is a limit to what we can observe, an invisible boundary beyond which light has never reached us. This is known as the causal horizon, the edge of the observable universe. Beyond it lie galaxies, stars, and entire cosmic structures that might as well be ghosts. We know they exist, but their light will never reach us. And if we can never interact with them, can we truly say they exist in any meaningful way? This is the causal horizon paradox, a mind-bending dilemma that challenges our understanding of reality and causality. If the universe is infinite and parts of it are forever out of reach, we are trapped within a cosmic bubble, cut off from the vast majority of existence. Yet physics tells us that the same fundamental laws govern the entire universe. But how can we claim to comprehend a reality that extends beyond what is even theoretically observable? To grasp this paradox, we must first understand the speed of light as the ultimate cosmic speed limit. According to Einstein's theory of relativity, nothing, no object or information, can travel faster than light. This means the farther away an object is from us, the longer its light takes to reach us. But here's the problem. The universe is expanding, and not just expanding, it's accelerating. The further a galaxy is from us, the faster it appears to be receding. At a certain distance, space itself expands faster than the speed of light, meaning that any light emitted from these regions can never reach us. This defines our cosmic horizon, the boundary between the observable universe and the parts that will forever remain unknown. This raises unsettling questions. If two distant regions of the universe can never interact, what determines the laws that govern both? Why should the laws of physics be uniform if the universe is permanently divided into isolated causal zones? If we can never verify what lies beyond, can we ever claim to truly understand the entirety of existence? Then, there's the issue of time. The causal horizon isn't static. It evolves as the universe expands. Over time, more and more regions cross this threshold, drifting irreversibly beyond our ability to detect them. Civilizations that might exist in those galaxies, if they ever did, will never be able to communicate with us. They might have seen our Milky Way long ago, but as time passes, our existence will fade from their view, as if we were never there at all. This paradox becomes even more perplexing when we think about the future. One day, even galaxies that are visible today will drift beyond the causal horizon. If the acceleration of the universe continues, the cosmos will eventually become a lonely void, where where each observer is trapped in their own shrinking bubble of space. Over billions of years, entire cosmic structures will vanish, not because they cease to exist, but because they are causally unreachable. The universe is not just expanding, it is erasing itself. But here's the real paradox. If we can never observe these regions, do they truly matter? Do they even exist in a meaningful way? This question goes beyond theoretical concern. It strikes at the very heart of physics. Our understanding of the universe is based on observable data. But if vast regions of reality are forever hidden from us, does that mean our knowledge of the cosmos will always be incomplete? Some physicists argue that the causal horizon defines the limits of reality itself. Anything beyond it might as well not exist, because it will never influence us. Others believe that reality does not require observation, and that the laws of physics must extend beyond our reach, even if we can never confirm it. Yet perhaps the most unsettling question is this. If the universe continues to expand, and everything eventually slips beyond the causal horizon, will there come a time when nothing remains visible at all? A universe that once stretched endlessly in every direction could shrink, not physically, but perceptually, until all that remains is a tiny island of matter adrift in an eternal void. The causal horizon paradox challenges everything we assume about space, time, and our place in the cosmos. It suggests that reality is not a unified whole, but an ever-fragmenting collection of isolated regions, each cut off from the rest, as the universe races toward an unknowable fate. And if we are forever bound within a shrinking sliver of existence, perhaps the greatest paradox of all is that the universe we think we understand may already be slipping beyond our reach. The paradox of thrift. The idea of saving money is often considered a wise and responsible habit, putting aside a portion of your income to build a safety net and ensure financial security for the future. On an individual level, this makes perfect sense. But what happens when saving, practiced by an entire society, causes economic collapse instead of stability? This is the paradox of thrift, a counterintuitive economic phenomenon suggesting that what is beneficial for one person can be disastrous for everyone when applied on a larger scale. At its core, the paradox reveals a contradiction. While saving money helps individuals accumulate wealth, widespread saving across a population can harm the economy by reducing overall demand. Here's how it works. When people choose to save instead of spend, businesses sell fewer goods and services. As revenues drop, companies may cut costs, often by laying off workers or reducing wages. Unemployment rises, people have even less money to spend, and demand shrinks further. This cycle continues, and the very thing people fear, a worsening economy, ends up happening precisely because they acted cautiously to avoid it. To see this paradox in action, imagine a small town where most of the population works for a handful of businesses, such as a bakery, a clothing shop, and a furniture store. If the town's residents suddenly decide to save more by cutting back on non-essential purchases, the bakery sells fewer pastries, the clothing shop sees fewer customers, and the furniture store's inventory piles up. In response, business owners may lay off employees or reduce wages to offset lost revenue. But those same employees are also the town's customers. The laid-off bakery worker now has even less money to spend on clothes or furniture. Store owners feel the downturn and cut back even more. The cycle continues, and what began as a cautious attempt to save has led to economic decline across the entire town. This problem doesn't only apply to small communities. It plays out on a national and global scale during economic downturns, like the Great Depression of the 1930s or the 2008 financial crisis. During these times, people instinctively save more and spend less. Businesses cut jobs, factories close, and the economy comes to a standstill. Governments try to intervene with stimulus measures, but the root of the crisis is a widespread collapse in consumer demand. The paradox was famously explored by economist John Maynard Keynes, who argued that during recessions, increased saving is dangerous because it reduces the total spending needed to keep an economy moving. He proposed that governments should step in by increasing public spending to compensate for the drop in private spending. This is why, during economic crises, governments often introduce stimulus checks, tax cuts, or large public works projects to encourage spending instead of saving. But this raises an uncomfortable question. If an economy depends on continuous spending to survive, does that mean saving is always bad? Not necessarily. The paradox doesn't apply during times of economic stability, when consumer demand is already high. In those cases, saving enables investments that drive long-term growth, such as businesses expanding, banks lending, and individuals funding education or retirement. The issue arises when saving becomes widespread during a downturn, triggering a chain reaction of falling demand and rising unemployment. The paradox of thrift also challenges the concept of financial responsibility. If saving too much can hurt the economy, does that mean reckless spending could be beneficial in extreme cases? In a society that embraces endless consumption, recession could be avoided, but at the cost of long-term sustainability. Debt would increase, resources would be depleted, and economic bubbles would form, only to burst later. Ultimately, the paradox of thrift is not just about money. It's about the delicate balance between individual choices and collective consequences. The paradox reveals a troubling truth about modern economies. Stability is not built on caution, but on the illusion of constant movement. When people stop spending, the entire system begins to unravel. It raises deeper questions about the nature of economic growth. If consumption is the engine that keeps everything running, is there ever a point when we can afford to stop? And if true financial security comes not from saving but from spending, can an economy ever be truly sustainable? The causal horizon paradox underscores the complexities of these interconnected issues. The self-reference paradox. It begins innocently, just a sentence, just an idea. But as soon as you try to analyze it, everything begins to unravel. Logic twists in on itself, folding into a contradiction that defies resolution. This is the self-reference paradox, a strange and unsettling result of logic reflecting back on itself. At its core, self-reference arises when a statement, rule, or system refers to itself in a way that creates a logical contradiction. The most well-known example is deceptively simple. This statement is false. If it's true, then it must be false. But if it's false, then it must be true. The statement suspends itself in a loop, neither true nor false, forever caught in contradiction. It exposes a deep vulnerability at the heart of how we define truth and logic. Yet, this paradox is more than a linguistic curiosity. It's a foundational fault line, one that runs through mathematics, philosophy, and even artificial intelligence. Consider Russell's paradox, which shook the foundations of set theory in the early 20th century. Bertrand Russell proposed a set that contains all sets that do not contain themselves. The question is simple: does this set contain itself? If it does, then by definition, it shouldn't. But if it doesn't, then by definition, it must. The system implodes under the weight of its own contradiction. Self-referential paradoxes like this one threaten the very notion of consistency in formal systems. This realization led to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which prove that any sufficiently complex logical system will contain truths that cannot be proven within the system itself. In short, no logical framework can be both complete and consistent. There will always be blind spots, inescapable gaps created by the system's own internal logic. The implications are profound. If self-reference can destabilize logic, what does that say about our understanding of truth? Can we ever build a perfect, airtight system of knowledge? Or will every such effort inevitably collapse under its own contradictions? In artificial intelligence, the self-reference paradox isn't just a theoretical concern. It's a practical and existential one. A machine built to follow strict logical rules can easily be trapped in self-referential loops. For example, if an AI is commanded to ignore this command, it may fall into a deadlock, unable to resolve the contradiction. Some theorists argue that true artificial consciousness might require the ability to navigate these paradoxes, to accept contradiction without failure, much like humans do. Which leads us to the enigma of consciousness itself. What happens when the mind tries to understand itself? Philosophers and neuroscientists have long wondered whether self-awareness is inherently paradoxical. Can the mind ever fully grasp its own workings? Or is it fated to become lost in an infinite loop of reflection, like a camera filming its own live feed? Some propose that consciousness is nothing more than a recursive illusion, a system constantly referring to itself without ever reaching a final, objective truth. The self-reference paradox is not an isolated oddity. It is embedded in the very structure of existence. It appears in our logic, our mathematics, our machines, and our minds. It suggests that some questions may have no answers, and some truths may always lie just beyond reach. And perhaps the greatest paradox of all is this. If self-reference can destabilize reality, does that mean reality itself is built on something unstable? Or, more curiously, could paradoxes be the very threads holding reality together? The information paradox of black holes. Beyond the reach of light lies one of the greatest mysteries in modern physics, a paradox so profound it threatens to unravel our very understanding of reality. It begins with a deceptively simple question. What happens to information when it falls into a black hole? At first glance, the answer should be clear, but it's not. This is the information paradox of black holes, a deep conflict between two foundational pillars of physics, general relativity and quantum mechanics. According to Einstein's general relativity, black holes are regions of space so dense that nothing, not even light, can escape their gravitational grip. Once anything crosses the event horizon, the point of no return, it is lost forever. But quantum mechanics tells a different story. In this framework, information, the fundamental blueprint describing the state of any system, can never be destroyed. If information enters a black hole and vanishes, something is terribly wrong. One of these two theories must give. To grasp why this is such a problem, consider throwing a book into a fire. It seems the information in the book, its words, its story, is gone. But on a microscopic level, the atoms and particles still exist. In theory, if you could trace every interaction, you could reconstruct the book from its ashes. The information isn't destroyed, it's just transformed. A black hole, however, doesn't behave like fire. When something crosses the event horizon, the information doesn't just change form, it appears to cease to exist. And that, according to quantum mechanics, should be impossible. If black holes can destroy information, then quantum theory, one of the most accurate and successful scientific models ever developed, breaks down. The rules governing the universe would need to be rewritten. For decades, physicists have wrestled with this contradiction. Some have argued that information is simply obliterated, but this undermines the very principles of quantum mechanics. Others propose that information is somehow preserved, not inside the black hole, but on its surface, the event horizon, encoded in unimaginably complex ways. This led to the holographic principle, the idea that all the information within a volume of space might actually be stored on its two-dimensional boundary, much like a hologram. Then came Hawking radiation, a revolutionary concept introduced by physicist Stephen Hawking. According to quantum theory, black holes aren't entirely black. They emit tiny amounts of radiation and slowly evaporate over time. Eventually, they disappear. But what happens to everything that fell in? Hawking originally believed that the information was lost forever. This radical conclusion sparked decades of heated debate. Later ideas suggested that information might be hidden within the Hawking radiation itself, scrambled and unrecognizable, but still there, slowly leaking back into the universe. In this view, black holes don't destroy information. They disguise it, like a burned book reduced to heat and smoke, still carrying the ghost of its original form. Yet the paradox remains unresolved. Some physicists speculate that black holes might be cosmic recycling centers, returning information in a form so distorted that it's effectively lost to us. Others suggest that the information never actually enters the black hole at all, but is stored in the structure of space-time itself. More radical theories propose that black holes are gateways to parallel universes, and that the information escapes into dimensions we cannot perceive. The information paradox is not just a physics problem, it's a reality problem. If information can be destroyed, our current understanding of the universe is incomplete. If it can't, then black holes must be something entirely different from what we thought. Somewhere in the depths of the cosmos, the answer exists. But for now, black holes remain more than just gravitational traps. They are riddles, cosmic puzzles swallowing not only matter and light, but the very rules of reality itself. The whole paradox, Nothing, the absence of something. A gap in reality. A place where matter should be, but isn't. And yet, despite being defined by emptiness, a hole undeniably exists. You can fall into one, dig one, even own one. But this raises a strange and unsettling question. How can nothing be something? This is the hole paradox, a philosophical puzzle that challenges our understanding of existence, absence, and the nature of reality itself. We speak of holes as though they are real. There's a hole in your sock, a hole in the ground, a black hole in space. But what are we really referring to? A sock is fabric. The ground is made of earth. Space, a vast expanse of matter and energy. But a hole? It's defined not by what is there, but by what's missing. The paradox is deceptively simple. If a hole is nothing, how can it have size, or shape, or depth? We can measure a hole in the wall, map it, repair it. But what exactly are we measuring? The hole itself, or the material around it? Suppose you fill a hole with dirt. The hole disappears, yet the dirt remains. Did the hole truly exist? Or was it merely an illusion, a temporary absence dressed up as an entity? This puzzle has haunted thinkers for centuries. Parmenides, the ancient Greek philosopher, argued that non-being cannot exist. If that's true, then a hole, defined by absence, should be impossible. And yet, we encounter holes every day. They must exist in some form. Language makes the paradox deeper. If holes are real, they should be objects we can count and manipulate. If they're not real, why do we speak of them as if they are? Modern physics complicates things further. Black holes are among the most extreme entities in the universe, regions of space with gravity so intense that nothing, not even light, can escape. But if a black hole is simply an absence of matter, how can it exert such tremendous force? How can nothing pull something? Even stranger, black holes appear to store information. They have entropy, surface area, temperature. In this sense, they are not mere voids, but structures, measurable, tangible, real. Not absence, presence. Linguistics adds another layer still. If you remove all the cheese from a cheese sandwich, is it still a sandwich? If you drain a lake, is the empty basin still a lake bed, or something else entirely? The way we use words shapes the way we understand the world. But holes resist definition. They aren't objects, yet they have attributes. They aren't matter, yet they shape the world. Some argue holes are properties, like wetness is to water. But that doesn't explain why we treat holes as things that exist on their own. Others say holes are conceptual placeholders, mental labels for the absence of material. But if that's true, what happens when you fall into one? What about holes so massive they swallow stars? In the end, the hole paradox forces us to confront a deeper mystery. Can nothingness be real? If a hole is an absence, does its presence contradict its nature? The more we try to define it, the more it slips through our grasp. A void in logic itself. Perhaps holes don't exist in space, but in thought. Gaps in our understanding. Minds shaped by absences as much as by substance. And like the holes we try to fill, some questions may never have a bottom. The crocodile paradox. Basking in the sunlight, the crocodile grips a child in its powerful jaws. A child snatched from the arms of a desperate, trembling parent. With an eerie calm, the creature proposes a strange deal. If you can correctly predict whether I will return your child, I will let them go. But if you're wrong, I will keep them. At first, this seems like a cruel but simple wager. The parent must either guess correctly or not. But quickly, the illusion of fairness dissolves. The trap isn't in the teeth, it's in the logic. Imagine the parent says, "You will not return my child." Now the crocodile is caught in a paradox. If the prediction is correct, if the crocodile wasn't going to return the child, then it must release the child, since the parent guessed correctly. But releasing the child would make the prediction false. On the other hand, if the crocodile keeps the child, the prediction turns out to be true, meaning the crocodile should have released the child. No matter what it chooses, the crocodile contradicts itself. This is the crocodile paradox, an ancient logical puzzle that exposes the unstable edges of conditional reasoning and self-reference. It belongs to a class of problems known as epistemic paradoxes, traps where knowledge, truth, and prediction twist into impossible knots. At its heart lies a contradiction. The outcome depends on the prediction, but the prediction also depends on the outcome. The logic collapses under its own weight, forming a loop with no consistent resolution. But step back, and the implications stretch beyond the riverbank. The paradox reflects the fragile nature of self-referential promises, not just in logic puzzles, but in real life. Imagine a politician declaring, "I will only keep this promise if you believe I won't." Or a legal contract stating, "This agreement is valid only if you doubt its validity." These are not just rhetorical tricks, they are logical minefields. Any rule that refers to itself in this way can spiral into contradiction. Even probability struggles here. If you were to place a bet on the crocodile's decision, what odds could you assign? There is no stable outcome to measure. Like Schrödinger's cat, both alive and dead until observed, the crocodile hovers in a kind of logical superposition, defying resolution. Deeper still, the paradox raises unsettling questions about trust and the nature of promises. The crocodile, in this light, becomes more than a beast. It is a symbol of uncertainty, a trickster force that reveals how fragile logic becomes when it turns in on itself. If a promise depends on a prediction, and that prediction shapes the promise, can any agreement ever be fully reliable? Some interpretations offer a possible escape. Since the crocodile invented the rules, perhaps it can simply act irrationally, breaking free from the paradox by abandoning logic altogether. But that raises a darker thought. What if reality itself, like the crocodile, doesn't always obey reason? What if paradoxes aren't just puzzles, but cracks in the foundation of logic? In the end, the crocodile paradox doesn't resolve. It isn't meant to. It's a mirror, held up to the limits of rational thought. And as the parent stands paralyzed, caught in the impossible choice, the crocodile is no longer just a monster. It is a reminder. Some questions have no escape. The barber paradox. In a small town, there's a peculiar rule. Every man must be clean-shaven. However, not all men shave themselves. Some rely on the town's only barber. This barber follows one strict rule. He shaves all, and only those men who do not shave themselves. At first glance, it seems like a perfectly logical setup, a neat division of labor. But then comes the question that unravels the whole arrangement. Who shaves the barber? If the barber doesn't shave himself, then according to his rule, he must shave himself. But if he does shave himself, then he must not shave himself, because he only shaves those who don't shave themselves. Either way, the rule contradicts itself. The barber cannot logically exist under these conditions. And yet, we began with the assumption that he does. That is the essence of the barber paradox, first formulated by philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell. On the surface, it sounds like a quirky riddle, but underneath lies a deep logical contradiction rooted in self-reference. The core problem lies in the barber's rule. It attempts to divide people into two clear categories, those who shave themselves and those shaved by the barber. But when the barber himself is subjected to the rule, it creates an impossible loop, a logical contradiction that cannot be resolved. Russell devised this paradox as a simplified example of a deeper issue in set theory. At the time, mathematicians believed sets, collections of objects, could be defined in straightforward, self-contained ways. But Russell discovered that some sets break down when defined in relation to themselves. His most famous example is the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Does this set contain itself? If it does, then by definition, it shouldn't. If it doesn't, then it should. Like the barber, it creates a paradox. This discovery shook the foundations of mathematical logic. It revealed that even simple, seemingly self-consistent systems can fall apart when they refer back to themselves. The result was a kind of existential crisis for mathematics, forcing a re-evaluation of how logical systems are built. One of the most significant responses came from Kurt Gödel, whose incompleteness theorems showed that any sufficiently powerful logical system will always contain truths that cannot be proven within the system itself. The barber paradox offers a glimpse into that deeper, unsettling truth. Some questions simply can't be answered within the rules they're framed by. But this isn't just a mathematical problem. Variations of the paradox appear in real life, in legal systems, bureaucracies, and even artificial intelligence. Any rule that attempts to define itself is at risk of collapsing. Consider a law that states, this law must be obeyed unless it contradicts itself. If you follow it, you break it. If you ignore it, you follow it. Just like the barber's rule, it self-destructs upon inspection. So what becomes of the barber? The answer is simple. He cannot exist, not under these rules. His policy works for everyone else, but breaks when applied to himself. The paradox isn't really about shaving. It's about the limitations of absolute, self-referential rules and systems that must account for themselves. Perhaps the true lesson of the barber paradox is this. Not everything that seems logical can actually be classified or resolved. And sometimes, the only way to solve a paradox is to recognize that the question itself is impossible to begin with. Newcomb's paradox. You stand in front of two boxes. One is transparent and clearly holds a crisp $1,000 bill. The other is opaque. Its contents are unknown. You're given a choice. Take only the opaque box, or take both boxes. Here's the catch. A highly advanced, super intelligent predictor has already foreseen your decision. If it predicted you would take only the opaque box, it placed $1 million inside. If it predicted you would take both, it left the opaque box empty. This is Newcomb's paradox, a famous thought experiment that seems to turn rational decision-making against itself. No matter how you try to reason through it, something doesn't add up. On one hand, it seems simple. The money in the opaque box is either there or it's not. It was placed there in the past. So, your choice now shouldn't change what's inside. If that's true, then you should take both boxes. Why not grab the guaranteed $1,000 in the transparent one, just in case the opaque one also has money? That's the logic of causal decision theory, which argues your present choice can't influence the past. If the money is there, you get $1,001,000. If it's not, you still get $1,000. So, taking both boxes should always be the better bet. Yet, strangely, those who take only the opaque box almost always walk away with $1 million. Those who take both usually leave with just $1,000. Enter evidential decision theory, a different approach. Instead of asking what your choice causes, it asks what your choice indicates. Choosing only the opaque box suggests you're the kind of person who won boxes, and the predictor, having foreseen this, likely put the money there. Choosing both boxes signals you're a two-boxer, and the predictor probably left the opaque one empty. The paradox hinges on prediction itself. How can a decision made in the present be accurately predicted in the past? If the predictor is truly infallible, does that mean free will is an illusion? And if free will doesn't exist, is the choice even real? Some try to resolve the paradox by denying the possibility of a perfect predictor. They argue such a being would violate causality and can't exist. But that doesn't fully defuse the dilemma. Even if the predictor is just extremely accurate, say, right 99.99999% of the time, the same logic and outcomes would apply. So then, shouldn't you one box, knowing that almost everyone who does ends up rich? Others suggest the paradox reveals something deeper about how we think. Traditional logic assumes a clean separation between past and future, cause and effect. But what if reality doesn't work that way? What if your choices are part of a tangled web of causation that stretches through time, so that your present decision is entangled with the past? Newcomb's paradox doesn't just challenge how we make decisions. It forces us to question our understanding of time, causality, and agency itself. It hints that even our simplest choices may not be entirely our own, that the past and future might be more connected than we imagine, and that our decisions might already be woven into the fabric of reality. So here you are, standing before two boxes. One clear, one mysterious. The choice is yours. Or was it made long before you ever arrived? The paradox of the criterion. At first glance, the question, how do you know what you know, seems simple. You might say you rely on reason, evidence, or experience. But how do you know those sources are trustworthy? What standard are you using to separate truth from illusion, knowledge from deception? And more importantly, how do you justify that standard itself? This is the paradox of the criterion, a problem that lies at the heart of epistemology, the study of knowledge. It reveals a circular trap in our pursuit of truth. To judge whether something is true, we need a reliable method. But to know if that method is reliable, we need a way to verify it. And to verify that, we need yet another standard, and so on, endlessly. The cycle never stops. Take a simple example. Suppose you say you trust your senses because they consistently give you information about the world. But how do you know that consistency means reliability? Perhaps because your reasoning tells you so. But how do you know your reasoning is valid? Because it seems logical. But who defines what logic is? Every attempt to ground knowledge leads to the need for a deeper foundation, one that itself cannot be verified without assuming its validity. That's the paradox. It presents two main dilemmas, or horns, each with unsettling consequences. On one side, if we demand absolute proof for our methods of distinguishing truth from falsehood, we fall into infinite regress, a never-ending chain of justifications that never arrives at a final, secure answer. On the other side, if we don't require such proof and simply assume some methods are valid without justification, then we risk building our understanding of reality on arbitrary, possibly false, foundations. Either way, certainty remains out of reach. Philosophers have struggled with this paradox for centuries. Skeptics like Sextus Empiricus argued that, since no ultimate criterion of truth can be established, we should suspend judgment on all knowledge claims. Others, like Descartes, attempted to escape the trap by identifying a self-evident starting point, his famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, as an indubitable foundation. But even this depends on the assumption that existence follows from thought, an idea that itself can be questioned. Modern thinkers have offered alternative models. Some suggest that knowledge isn't built on a strict hierarchy of foundations, but resembles a web, where beliefs support one another in a coherent system. Yet coherence alone doesn't guarantee truth. A well-structured delusion is still a delusion. So where does that leave us? Are we trapped in an endless epistemic loop, forever unable to prove anything beyond doubt? Or do we move forward by accepting certain assumptions on faith, operating in the face of uncertainty? The paradox of the criterion reveals a deep fracture in human understanding. It reminds us that even our most basic knowledge rests on unprovable assumptions. And so the question continues to echo through the ages. How do you know what you know? And how do you know that you know it? The free will paradox. Imagine standing at a crossroads, staring down two diverging paths, left or right. The decision feels entirely your own, as if, in this moment, you could freely choose either direction. But could you? What if, from the moment of your birth, the neurons in your brain, the laws of physics, and the endless chain of cause and effect had already determined the path you'd take? This is the free will paradox, a riddle at the very heart of human existence. Are we truly in control of our choices? Or are we simply acting out a script written by forces beyond our understanding? The paradox arises when we try to reconcile two seemingly incompatible truths. We feel as though we make free choices, yet every choice seems to be the inevitable outcome of what came before. If we assume the universe is deterministic, then every action, every thought, every hesitation, every decision is part of an unbroken chain of events stretching back to the dawn of time. The motion of the planets, the firing of neurons, the unfolding of history, all of it, like a cosmic domino effect. If that's true, then free will is an illusion. You could no more choose differently than a falling rock could decide to stop midair. But what if we reject determinism and claim that our choices are truly free? We face another problem. If a decision isn't caused by anything prior, if it emerges from nowhere, unbound by past events, then isn't it just randomness? A cosmic roll of the dice? And if our actions arise purely by chance, can they be called choices at all? A random process is not the same as a willful decision. This is where the paradox tightens its grip. If our actions are caused, we are not free. If they are uncaused, they are meaningless. No matter which direction we turn, true free will seems to slip through our fingers. Some have tried to escape the paradox by redefining what free will means. One view holds that as long as our choices align with our desires and reasoning, even if those desires are themselves determined, we can still consider them free. Others embrace compatibilism, the idea that determinism and free will are not in conflict, but rather describe different layers of the same reality. In this view, our choices may be determined, but because they arise from our own minds, shaped by our own reasoning, they still belong to us. Quantum mechanics introduces another twist. Unlike classical physics, which operates under strict causality, quantum theory allows for uncertainty. Some have speculated that this randomness might offer a loophole for free will. But randomness alone doesn't grant us meaningful choice. It merely swaps one problem for another. So the paradox remains. We feel like conscious agents, actively steering our lives. But the paradox whispers otherwise. If we are bound by causality, then every word, every movement, every belief was always inevitable. If we are free, our choices must somehow transcend cause and effect, without collapsing into chaos. So ask yourself, did you freely choose to read this? Or was it always going to happen? Maybe the choice was never really yours to begin with. The absent-minded driver paradox. A lone driver speeds down a dark highway, his thoughts drifting like the flickering road signs passing by. He knows his destination, a fork in the road where a critical choice must be made. One path leads home, the other into the unknown. But there's a problem. The driver is absent-minded. By the time he reaches the fork, he might forget where he is. And worse, forget that a choice is even required. This is the absent-minded driver paradox, a strange riddle that challenges logic, probability, and the very nature of decision-making itself. The setup is deceptively simple. Imagine a driver navigating a highway with a single major split. Before setting off, he understands the rules. Choose correctly, and he reaches his goal. Choose wrong, and he's trapped in a loop, forced to drive endlessly. At the beginning of his journey, he can reason clearly. He weighs the odds, calculates the probabilities, and crafts a plan. But once he's on the road, everything changes. His memory is unreliable. When he reaches the fork, he can't tell whether it's the first time or if he's already made the wrong turn before. His past decisions vanish from his mind, leaving him only with the present moment and a 50-50 guess. The paradox lies in this disconnect. He begins with perfect logic, yet at the crucial moment, that logic collapses into randomness. He knows the right move in theory, but can never reliably act on it in practice. What should be a calculated decision becomes a gamble. Philosophers and mathematicians have long wrestled with this puzzle. Rationality says he should take the correct exit the first time he encounters it. But since he can't tell if this is the first time, or the second, or the third, every fork feels like the first. Every decision is equally uncertain. That's what makes the paradox so haunting. It shows how memory and perception can undermine even the most carefully laid reasoning. At its core, the absent-minded driver paradox exposes a flaw in how we understand rational decision-making. We assume we act based on the best available information. But what happens when we don't know what information we have, or whether we're repeating a mistake? In life, we often believe we're making fresh choices, unaware that we may be retracing old errors. This paradox extends beyond a mere thought experiment. It echoes through real-world dilemmas, from economic behavior to moral judgment. How often do we assume we're acting wisely, only to fall into the same cycles of failure? How often do we feel in control, only to realize we're at the mercy of forgotten decisions? And so the driver continues, unaware if this fork is new or one he's already passed. He hesitates, grips the wheel, and makes his choice. Whether it leads him home or back into the loop, he will never know. The Monty Hall paradox. Imagine you're on a game show stage with 3 closed doors. Behind one is a shiny new car, and behind the other 2, nothing but worthless goats. The host, smiling, asks you to choose a door. You pick door number 1. But before he reveals what's behind it, the host does something unexpected. He opens another door, revealing a goat. He then gives you the option to switch to the remaining door. It seems like a 50-50 choice now, doesn't it? But does it really matter if you switch or stay? Welcome to the Monty Hall paradox, one of the most famous and counterintuitive puzzles in probability, named after Monty Hall, the host of the classic game show Let's Make a Deal. This paradox challenges our natural instincts about probability and shows how unreliable our intuition can be when faced with uncertainty. At first glance, it seems that staying or switching should make no difference. After all, there are 2 doors left, and one has the car. Shouldn't the odds be 50-50? But the math tells a different story. Let's rewind and look at the situation from the start. When you initially choose a door, you have a 1 in 3 chance of picking the car and a 2 in 3 chance of picking a goat. If you happen to pick the car, switching will make you lose. But if you initially pick a goat, switching will win you the car. Here's the crucial insight. Since there was a 2 in 3 chance you picked a goat, switching gives you a 2 in 3 chance of winning the car. Many people still resist believing this, trusting their gut feeling that it's a 50-50 shot. Even professional mathematicians have been known to initially reject the solution. The paradox gained widespread attention after being popularized by Marilyn Vos Savant in the 1990s, when thousands of readers sent angry letters insisting that switching couldn't possibly improve the odds. They were wrong. A way to better understand why switching is the smarter choice is to imagine the game with many more doors. Suppose there are 100 doors instead of 3. You choose one door at random, meaning you have only a 1% chance of picking the car. This leaves a 99% chance that the car is behind one of the other doors. Monty Hall, knowing what's behind each door, reveals 98 goats, leaving only one unopened door. Would you switch? Of course you would. The odds are now overwhelmingly in your favor, and the logic is the same as with 3 doors, though harder to see. So why does the Monty Hall paradox feel so deceptive? It's because our brains don't easily grasp how probability works in these situations. We tend to assume that new information resets the chances rather than shifting the existing probabilities. The key detail is that Monty isn't opening a random door. He's deliberately opening one that doesn't contain the car. This controlled elimination of possibilities is what makes switching the better choice. This paradox extends beyond game shows and probability puzzles. It reflects a deeper flaw in human reasoning. Our instincts often fail to properly account for conditional probabilities, which can lead us to make irrational decisions in areas ranging from gambling to medical diagnoses. In real life, we often assume 2 options are equal when hidden factors significantly affect the odds. The Monty Hall paradox also touches on the broader theme of decision-making. It highlights our resistance to change, even when we're presented with logical proof that switching is the right move. Emotional attachment to an initial choice, fear of regret, or simply the unwillingness to accept that our intuition might be wrong can all keep us from making the best decision. Ultimately, the Monty Hall paradox isn't just about doors, goats, or game shows. It's about how we perceive probability, how we resist counterintuitive truths, and how deeply flawed our reasoning can be when faced with uncertainty. It teaches us that the best decision often feels wrong, and that sometimes the smartest move is to let go of what we thought we knew. So, next time life offers you a second chance, ask yourself, is this just a meaningless choice, or are the odds shifting in my favor? The quantum Zeno effect. Imagine setting up an unstable particle that's supposed to decay within a few seconds. However, something strange happens. The more frequently the particle is observed, the less likely it is to decay. It seems to remain in its original state, almost as though the act of watching it freezes it in time. This phenomenon is known as the quantum Zeno effect, a paradox within quantum mechanics suggesting that constant observation can prevent change from occurring. Named after the ancient philosopher Zeno of Elea, who proposed paradoxes about motion and progress, this effect challenges our understanding of cause and effect, as well as the role of observation in shaping reality. To grasp the strangeness of this effect, think of a simple analogy. Imagine a candle burning down, its wax slowly melting as the flame consumes it. Now, picture a scenario where every time you glance at it, the candle resets to its original height. As long as you keep looking at it frequently enough, it never burns down. But the moment you stop observing it, the candle continues as if nothing had happened. In this paradox, your observation halts the passage of time for the candle. This is eerily similar to what happens at the quantum level. In quantum mechanics, particles don't behave like classical objects that move predictably through space. Instead, they exist in superpositions, meaning they occupy multiple possible states simultaneously. However, when you observe a quantum system, its wave function collapses, forcing it into a single state. If you observe it repeatedly at the right intervals, you can prevent it from transitioning to a different state, effectively trapping it in place. This suggests that the act of measurement determines whether a particle changes or remains unchanged. The quantum Zeno effect isn't just a thought experiment. It has been confirmed in real-world experiments. Scientists have observed that certain particles, when measured rapidly enough, appear to freeze in their initial state, defying expectations about how they should evolve over time. Physicists have conducted tests with atoms, photons, and superconducting qubits, finding that repeated observation prevents their natural decay. This implies that measurement isn't merely a passive way to gather information. It actively alters the system's evolution. The implications of the quantum Zeno effect go far beyond atomic particles. It raises unsettling questions about the nature of time, consciousness, and reality itself. If observing something over and over again can prevent change, then is time truly flowing continuously, or is it only real when measured? What if, at some fundamental level, time isn't an independent force, but something tied directly to observation? This idea touches on an even deeper mystery. If everything requires measurement to truly change, what was time doing before conscious observers existed to measure it? Even more unsettling is the notion that the quantum Zeno effect could, in theory, be applied to biological systems. If rapid observation can stop atomic decay, could it also halt the processes responsible for aging, or even death? Some physicists have speculated, half-jokingly, that a perfectly aware consciousness, observing itself in an unbroken loop, could exist in a kind of frozen state, untouched by the natural flow of time. This idea echoes certain concepts in Eastern philosophy, which suggest that reality is shaped by awareness, and that observation itself is a force. This paradox also connects to a broader mystery in quantum physics known as the measurement problem, the unresolved question of why the act of measuring a quantum system forces it into a definite state. If observation truly plays a fundamental role in shaping particle behavior, what does this imply about the universe itself? Could the reality we experience be a vast quantum system that only solidifies when observed? Some interpretations of quantum mechanics, such as the participatory universe model proposed by physicist John Wheeler, suggest that reality might not exist in a definite form until it is perceived. There is also the possibility that the quantum Zeno effect points to a deep connection between time and consciousness. If time slows or halts under continuous observation, could our perception of time be shaping reality itself? Neuroscientists have observed that during heightened awareness, such as in life-threatening situations, people report that time seems to stretch or slow down. While this is often explained as the brain processing information more rapidly, could it also be a macroscopic reflection of a quantum phenomenon? In the end, the quantum Zeno effect is not just a bizarre trick of physics. It is a gateway to some of the most profound questions about existence. It suggests that change itself may not be an inherent feature of reality, but something that depends on interaction, perception, and awareness. It forces us to reconsider whether we are passive observers in a universe unfolding independently of us, or whether we play a much more active role in determining the fate of reality itself. Does time flow continuously, or does it only move forward when we stop looking? And if observing reality prevents it from changing, what happens to a universe that is never observed at all? Causal loop paradoxes. A man finds a manuscript on the top shelf and flips through its pages, only to realize that it contains detailed instructions for constructing a time machine. He spends years deciphering the text, building the machine, and eventually traveling back in time. Upon his arrival, he feels an inexplicable urge to leave the very same manuscript in the bookstore, where, decades later, his past self will discover it. But who wrote the manuscript? It wasn't created by anyone. It simply exists, looping through time with no clear origin. This is a causal loop paradox, a situation where an event is locked in a continuous cycle of cause and effect with no discernible beginning. People, objects, or even knowledge can become trapped in time, existing solely because they were always meant to. Imagine a scientist who receives blueprints for an advanced technology from a visitor claiming to be from the future. The scientist builds the device, and years later, he sends the blueprints back in time to his younger self. The knowledge appears to have no point of origin. It simply exists within the loop. Did the scientist invent the technology, or did the technology invent itself? The problem with causal loops is that they challenge the fundamental nature of cause and effect. Normally, events unfold in a sequence. A leads to B, and B leads to C. But in a causal loop, this sequence folds back on itself, creating a timeline that is self-sustaining but logically incomplete. This defies the very idea that events need a beginning. One famous example is the predestination paradox, a variant of the causal loop where someone attempts to change the past but inadvertently causes the very event they were trying to prevent. A time traveler goes back to warn a scientist about an impending disaster, hoping to avert it, only to find that the warning triggers the very events that lead to the catastrophe. Instead of breaking the cycle, the traveler becomes an unknowing part of it. Another example is the ontological paradox, which applies to objects and information that appear to come from nowhere. A musician in the present learns a beautiful song from an old recording. Years later, he plays it for a young listener, who records it. That recording eventually reaches the original musician, whose song is now created in the past. The song has no true creator. It exists in a perpetual loop, constantly passing through time. Some physicists argue that causal loops aren't entirely impossible. The laws of physics, particularly within the framework of general relativity, don't strictly forbid time loops, although they remain purely theoretical. If such loops were possible, they might create self-contained histories, where certain events simply happen without any external cause. Others suggest that paradoxes like these imply that time travel can't work the way we imagine. Some mechanism, whether it's the very nature of reality or an unknown law of physics, must prevent causal loops from forming. After all, if the universe allowed objects, people, or information to appear without an origin, wouldn't that violate everything we understand about the conservation of matter and the progression of time? Yet the unsettling possibility remains. What if some things don't need an origin? What if reality allows for events to exist simply because they must? A notebook filled with knowledge, a song that writes itself, or a time traveler who shapes his own past. Causal loops challenge our deepest assumptions about what it means for something to exist at all. The two envelopes paradox. Imagine you're given two envelopes, each containing an unknown sum of money. You know that one envelope contains exactly twice the amount of the other. You pick one envelope at random, open it, and now face the decision. Keep it or switch to the other envelope. At first glance, this seems simple. If your envelope contains $100, for instance, the other envelope could hold either $50 or $200. But then things start to get complicated. If the other envelope contains $200, switching would double your money. If it holds $50, switching would cut your money in half. Initially, the odds seem even. There's a 50% chance for either outcome. You start calculating your expected winnings, and this is where the paradox arises. If you switch, there's a 50% chance of gaining $100 or losing $50. When you average the possibilities, you find that the expected value of switching is $125. Wait a second. If switching always increases your expected payout, then logically, you should always switch. But here's the strange part. This reasoning applies no matter what's inside your first envelope. If you had picked the other one first, the same logic would make you want to switch again. This creates an endless loop of doubt. You should switch, but then you should switch again, and so on forever. How can this be? The paradox arises from the way we use probability and expectation. When you open the envelope, you assign equal probabilities to the other envelope containing either half or double the amount. But this assumption only makes sense before you see the number inside. Once you've opened the envelope, the amounts aren't random. They were determined by a hidden rule you don't know. The mistake is treating the revealed amount as though it were randomly assigned, when it was actually chosen according to the rules of the game. Another way to resolve the paradox is by considering that it's based on an infinite scale of money. If there's no upper limit to the amount of money the envelopes could contain, switching always seems to make sense. But in reality, there must be some limit to how much money the envelopes could hold. Without knowing that limit, the probabilities become meaningless. Some mathematicians argue that the paradox is an illusion, a result of how we frame the problem. The way we set up the expectation calculation leads to a logically appealing, but ultimately misleading, answer. Others suggest that the paradox highlights a deeper issue with our intuitive understanding of probability, especially in situations where relative values obscure absolute ones. Perhaps the most unsettling conclusion is that there is no rational way out. The paradox traps you in an endless cycle where every logical step leads you back to the same uncertainty. No matter what you choose, you can't shake the feeling that you've made the wrong decision. So do you switch or stay? The paradox challenges not only our understanding of probability, but also the very limits of rational decision-making itself. The measure problem in cosmology. In cosmology, when considering an infinite universe, what does it mean to say that one event is more likely than another? If there are infinite galaxies, infinite Earth-like planets, and infinite versions of yourself watching or listening to this right now, how can we even begin to talk about probabilities? The measure problem in cosmology is a paradox that arises when trying to assign meaningful probabilities in a universe that might have no limits. At first glance, probability seems simple. If you flip a fair coin, the chances of landing heads or tails are 50/50ths. If you roll a six-sided die, each number has a 1 in 6 chance of appearing. But when dealing with infinity, probabilities lose their meaning. How do we measure how often something happens when there are infinite copies of everything happening? Imagine a vast multiverse, where new universes are constantly being created. Some of these universes might resemble our own, while others may have radically different physics, stars that burn cold, planets that never form, life that evolves in unimaginable ways. Suppose we ask a simple question: what fraction of all universes contain intelligent life? To answer, we would need to count the number of universes with life and compare them to those without it. But if both numbers are infinite, the ratio becomes meaningless. Infinity divided by infinity doesn't provide a well-defined answer. It's an unsolvable mathematical expression, an undefined quantity. Even if there are far more lifeless universes than those with life in an infinite system, everything happens infinitely many times, making any fraction ambiguous. The problem deepens when we attempt to predict the future of our own universe. Many cosmological theories suggest that space is constantly expanding, with quantum fluctuations giving rise to new regions that might evolve into separate universes. This is known as eternal inflation. If new universes are being created infinitely, how can we determine which outcomes are common and which are rare? To solve this, physicists often introduce a measure, a mathematical method to compare infinities and assign meaningful probabilities. However, every way of measuring infinity leads to contradictions. Some methods suggest that we are overwhelmingly likely to live in a young, chaotic universe, while others imply that our observations of dark energy, the mysterious force driving cosmic expansion, are highly improbable. One unsettling consequence of the measure problem is that it may challenge the anthropic principle, the idea that the universe appears fine-tuned for life because we are here to observe it. If infinite universes exist, then every possible version of reality happens somewhere, including those where life arises purely by chance, without any fine-tuning. Does our universe really need to be special, or is it just one of infinite possibilities with no deeper significance? Some physicists have proposed introducing artificial limits, cutoffs, to make infinite systems manageable. For instance, if you try to count how many even numbers exist, you might stop at 1,000, finding there are 500. At 1,000,000, there are 500,000. But in reality, the set of even numbers is infinite, just as the set of odd numbers is. Any cutoff distorts reality rather than truly solving the problem. Other solutions suggest that our understanding of probability itself might be flawed. Perhaps in an infinite universe, we need to reconsider what it means to say one event is more likely than another. Maybe our intuition, shaped by a world of finite numbers, simply cannot comprehend the nature of an infinite cosmos. The measure problem forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about existence. If our universe is just one among infinite possibilities, what does that say about our place in it? If everything that can happen does happen somewhere, what distinguishes our reality from any other? Are we truly experiencing a unique universe, or simply one of countless others with no special significance? Perhaps the most disturbing implication of the measure problem is that without a well-defined measure, all predictions about the future of the universe become meaningless. If we can't assign probabilities in an infinite system, then science, at least in cosmology, might reach fundamental limitations. If every possibility occurs infinitely many times, then anything that can happen has already happened, is happening now, and will happen again somewhere. And if that's the case, then what does it even mean for something to be likely anymore? The infinite hotel paradox. Imagine the infinite hotel paradox. A weary traveler arrives at a hotel after a long journey, hoping to secure a room for the night. The receptionist, a well-dressed man with an unnervingly calm demeanor, greets him with an apologetic smile. "I'm terribly sorry," he says, "but we are completely full." The traveler looks up at the sign above the entrance. Hilbert's Grand Hotel. Infinite rooms, infinite guests. How can a hotel with an infinite number of rooms be full? And more intriguingly, if every room is occupied, why does the receptionist's smile suggest there's still a way in? This is the infinite hotel paradox, a mind-bending thought experiment created by mathematician David Hilbert. It forces us to grapple with the bizarre nature of infinity, a concept that defies the logic of finite numbers. At first glance, a hotel with infinite rooms seems like it should never be full. But what if every room is occupied? When a new guest arrives, it appears as though there's no space left. Yet, Hilbert's receptionist offers a solution. "Not to worry," he says. "I'll simply move every guest one room over. The person in room 1 moves to room 2, the guest in room 2 moves to room 3, and so on. Since there's no last room, this shifting can continue indefinitely. Room 1 is now vacant, and the traveler is free to check in." The paradox of infinity is that there's always room for more. But the real strangeness begins when larger groups arrive. Suppose an infinite number of travelers show up, each hoping for a room. The receptionist, barely flinching, says, "It's simple. Every guest will move to a room number that is twice their current room number. The guest in room 1 moves to room 2, the guest in room 2 moves to room 4, the guest in room 3 moves to room 6, and so on. Now all odd-numbered rooms, an infinite set of them, are free, and the infinite new guests are assigned to those rooms." The hotel was already full, yet it still managed to accommodate an entirely new infinity of guests. If this sounds impossible, that's because it is, at least in the world of finite numbers. In our everyday experience, a full parking lot means no more cars can enter. A full restaurant means no more diners can be seated. But infinity doesn't follow those rules. Infinity is not a number, but a concept, one that allows for counterintuitive results. The paradox deepens further. Suppose every guest in the hotel suddenly checks out, leaving all rooms empty. How many guests remain? The intuitive answer is 0. But infinity doesn't behave predictably. Depending on how you count, the number of remaining guests could still be infinite, or paradoxically, less than infinity, but greater than 0. Infinity bends the very notion of quantity. This paradox isn't just a mathematical curiosity. It has profound implications for how we understand the universe. Cosmologists have debated whether the universe itself is infinite. If it is, then questions about size, duplication, and possibility become as strange as Hilbert's hotel. If the universe is infinite, then there are an infinite number of versions of you existing in different variations of reality. If time is infinite, does anything truly begin or end? The infinite hotel paradox also appears in probability and logic. If an infinite universe contains an infinite number of events, then every possibility, no matter how unlikely, must happen somewhere. There's a version of you that has lived an identical life up until this moment, but just decided to stand up and walk away. There's a version of Earth where the laws of physics are slightly different, causing light to bend in ways we can't even comprehend. In an infinite system, the impossible becomes inevitable. Yet, the paradox also serves as a warning. Infinity isn't just a playground for strange thought experiments. It challenges how we define reality itself. If infinity can accommodate more guests without ever truly being full, then what does full even mean? If an infinite universe contains all possibilities, then what does possible mean? As the traveler settles into his newly vacated room, he reflects on the absurdity of it all. The hotel was full, but not really. More guests arrived, yet it still wasn't full. An infinite number of guests left, yet infinity remained. The receptionist hands him a key with an amused look. "Infinity is funny like that," he says. "Would you like to extend your stay indefinitely?" The Sleeping Beauty Paradox. The Sleeping Beauty Paradox presents a peculiar thought experiment. Imagine you're part of a research study where, on Sunday, you are put to sleep and a fair coin is flipped. If it lands heads, you will wake up on Monday, and the experiment ends. If it lands tails, you'll wake up on Monday, be put back to sleep, and then wake up again on Tuesday. Each time you wake up, your memory of the prior awakenings is erased. When you wake up, disoriented but aware of the experiment, the researcher asks you one simple question. What is the probability that the coin landed heads? At first glance, the answer seems straightforward. The coin is fair, meaning there's a 50% chance it landed heads and a 50% chance it landed tails. But as soon as you wake up, things become much less certain. Because your memory is erased between awakenings, you have no way of knowing whether it's Monday or Tuesday. All you know is that you're awake. How should this affect your probability assessment? This is the essence of the Sleeping Beauty paradox, a deceptively simple probability puzzle that challenges logical intuition. The central question is, does the act of waking up change how probabilities should be assigned? Two groups, known as halfers and thirders, have debated this question for years, each believing the other is making a critical mistake. The halfer argument is simple. Before the experiment begins, Sleeping Beauty knows the coin has a 50% chance of landing heads and a 50% chance of landing tails. Since waking up doesn't provide any new information about the fairness of the coin, the probability of heads remains 50%. In other words, the number of times you wake up shouldn't affect the initial probability. On the other hand, the thirders argue from a different perspective. If the coin lands heads, you'll wake up only once on Monday. If it lands tails, you'll wake up twice on Monday and Tuesday. Since each awakening is indistinguishable, and you're equally likely to find yourself in any one of them, there are three possible situations in which you could wake up. 1. You wake up on Monday after the coin landed heads. 2. You wake up on Monday after the coin landed tails. 3. You wake up on Tuesday after the coin landed tails. Out of these three possible scenarios, only one corresponds to the coin landing heads. Since you're guaranteed to be in one of these situations but can't know which, the probability of heads upon waking is 1/3, or roughly 33%, rather than 50%. This reasoning is based on the idea that the number of times you wake up is directly tied to the coin flip's outcome. Since waking up twice is twice as likely in the tails case, the probability should reflect this bias. The paradox raises important questions about how probabilities should be interpreted when events depend on subjective experience, on how many times an observer exists rather than just the raw odds. The Sleeping Beauty paradox is not just an abstract thought experiment. It touches on fundamental issues in probability theory and has implications beyond the experiment itself. Some theorists link the paradox to the anthropic principle, which suggests that our own existence should influence how we assess probabilities about the universe. For example, if we're part of an experiment where some realities contain more versions of us than others, should we consider our own presence as evidence that skews the odds? The paradox also has implications for quantum mechanics, particularly in the many-worlds interpretation. In this view, every quantum event spawns multiple universes, each representing a different outcome. If reality splits into different branches, each with varying numbers of observers, should probability shift accordingly? Could the Sleeping Beauty paradox serve as an analogy for our own place in the multiverse? Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the paradox is its challenge to how we perceive certainty in everyday life. We rely on probabilities to guide decisions, assuming that new evidence updates our beliefs in a predictable way. Yet, in the case of the Sleeping Beauty experiment, even when no new information is introduced, the very act of being conscious forces us to reassess our understanding of reality. So, when you wake up in the experiment, staring at the ceiling with no memory of whether it's your first or second awakening, ask yourself, are you living in a world where the coin landed heads, or are you simply more likely to exist in a world where tails created more versions of you? And if the nature of probability depends on the observer, what does that mean for every waking moment of your own life? The teletransportation paradox. Imagine stepping into a machine, a marvel of technology, a transporter capable of disassembling you atom by atom, recording your entire molecular structure, and transmitting the data across vast distances. At the destination, using raw matter, the machine reconstructs you down to the finest details, every neuron, every memory, every tiny imperfection of your skin replicated precisely. You step out, feeling just as you did before, remembering your life exactly as it was. But was the you that entered the machine truly the same as the one that emerged? Or did the original version of you cease to exist, leaving behind only a perfect copy? This is the essence of the teletransportation paradox, a thought experiment that challenges our deepest intuitions about identity, consciousness, and what it truly means to exist. If a machine could perfectly duplicate you, molecule by molecule, and recreate you somewhere else, would you still be you? Or would the original you have died, leaving only a replica behind? The paradox begins with a simple question: what defines the self? If identity is purely about physical arrangement, then as long as the copy is identical, it must be the same person. But if identity is rooted in an unbroken continuity of experience, then the original self dies, and no matter how perfect the copy, it begins its own separate existence. Consider a disturbing variation of the paradox. Instead of dismantling you, the transporter malfunctions and creates an identical copy of you at the destination without destroying the original. Now, two versions of you exist. Which one is the real you? If both versions remember stepping into the machine, recall the same childhood memories, and share the same thoughts, how could one be more authentic than the other? Yet, standing face to face, each would see the other as an imposter. This problem becomes even more unsettling when we apply it to everyday life. What if this issue isn't just confined to futuristic teleportation, but happens all the time? The human body is in constant flux. Its cells are constantly being replaced, and most of the atoms that make up your body today are not the same ones you were born with. If identity persists despite these physical changes, what makes you the same person from one moment to the next? If a perfect copy of you exists, and you feel like you are still you, what prevents that copy from being just as much you as the original? Some philosophers suggest that consciousness is an illusion of continuity, a trick of the brain that stitches together experiences into a seamless narrative. But the teletransportation paradox forces us to reconsider whether this continuity is genuine or simply a comforting story we tell ourselves. If a machine could replicate you instantly without you even noticing, would it matter? And if it does matter, if something essential is lost in the process, what exactly is that essence, and where does it go? The paradox has implications far beyond teleportation. If we could upload consciousness into machines, preserving every memory and personality trait, would the uploaded version still be truly you, or just an imitation? Would you survive the process, or would you die, leaving only a ghost in the machine? Some argue that identity is defined by the continuity of patterns, not by the physical continuity of the body. If a person's consciousness is defined by their thoughts, memories, and behaviors, then as long as these are preserved, their identity remains intact. By this reasoning, teleportation is no different from waking up each morning. The old self ceases to exist, and a new one, indistinguishable from the old, takes its place. But if this is true, then every moment is a kind of teleportation. The you that exists now is no more connected to the past than a perfect replica would be. So the question remains, if you step into the machine, knowing you'll emerge on the other side, seemingly unchanged, do you trust it? Or do you hesitate, sensing that something indescribable, something beyond atoms and data, might be lost in the process? The twin paradox. Two twins, born at the same moment and identical in every way. One stays on Earth, living a normal life, while the other boards a spacecraft and speeds away near the speed of light. Decades later, they reunite, but something extraordinary has occurred. The twin who stayed on Earth has aged significantly, while the traveler appears mysteriously young. Time itself has defied intuition, creating a paradox that seems impossible, a paradox that challenges our understanding of time, motion, and identity. At first glance, the twin paradox seems straightforward. According to special relativity, time slows down for objects moving at high speeds relative to a stationary observer. The faster an object moves, the more slowly time passes for it. This means that as the traveling twin accelerates close to the speed of light, they experience time at a much slower rate than their twin on Earth. When they return, decades may have passed for the earthbound twin, while only a few years have passed for the traveler. But here's where the paradox deepens. From the perspective of the traveling twin, it is the Earth that is moving at high speed, not them. If motion is relative, shouldn't the earthbound twin also experience time dilation, causing them to age more slowly too? The paradox appears to create a contradiction. Both twins should see the other as aging slower. meaning they should be the same age when reunited. Yet, only one twin remains younger. To resolve this, we must understand that the paradox isn't truly symmetrical. The key is acceleration. The traveling twin does not remain in a single, unchanging frame of reference. They accelerate away from Earth, turn around, and then accelerate back. In contrast, the twin on Earth stays in an inertial frame of reference, experiencing no dramatic shifts in velocity. The act of turning around breaks the symmetry of the situation. One twin undergoes acceleration and deceleration, while the other does not. Special relativity alone doesn't fully solve the paradox, but when combined with general relativity, which explains how acceleration affects time, the resolution becomes clear. Acceleration shifts the traveling twin onto a different time path, altering their aging process compared to their stationary sibling. The implications of the twin paradox extend beyond a mere thought experiment. If time can slow down depending on motion, does this mean time is not absolute? The answer, confirmed by experiments with high-speed particles and atomic clocks, is yes. Time is not a universal constant. It is elastic, bending and stretching based on speed and gravity. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station, moving at high velocities relative to Earth, experience time slightly more slowly than those on the planet's surface. Although the difference is minuscule, measurable only in fractions of a second, it confirms that time is not fixed. But the paradox forces us to question even deeper. If two people can age at different rates depending on their motion, what does that mean for personal identity? Could a traveler at near-light speed return to Earth centuries later, only to find that everyone they knew has long since passed? Does time dilation create a one-way path into the future from which there is no return? There's also another unsettling aspect of the paradox. If time is flexible, then our understanding of past, present, and future might be an illusion. If motion alters how time flows, does this mean that time itself is simply another dimension, like space? Are we all moving through time at different rates, unaware of how relative our existence truly is? The twin paradox isn't just a mathematical trick or an illusion of perception. It's real, tested, and verified. Time doesn't flow the same for all observers. We tend to think of time as steady, universal, and fair, but physics tells a different story. It whispers that time is fragile, shaped by motion and gravity. The ticking of a clock might betray the very thing it was designed to measure. So, the question remains, if time is not absolute, if reality itself bends under the laws of motion, what does it mean to live in a universe where two people, born in the same moment, may never truly share the same time? The unexpected lottery paradox. A lottery ticket may seem worthless, as the odds of winning are so infinitesimally small that no rational person should expect to win. And yet, someone always does. This paradox forces us to confront a contradiction at the core of probability, logic, and belief. If an event is so unlikely that we have no reason to expect it, how do we make sense of the fact that it still happens? At its core, the paradox is simple. Imagine a massive lottery with millions, even billions, of participants. The chance of any single individual winning is so small that it seems rational to believe that no one will win. If we apply this reasoning to every single ticket, we would conclude that the lottery will have no winner at all. Yet, when the numbers are drawn, a winning ticket emerges. This creates a paradox. We were logically justified in believing that no one would win, but we were inevitably proven wrong. This paradox is closely related to the problem of probabilistic reasoning, where extremely low probabilities lead to seemingly absurd conclusions. Take another example. Imagine a fair coin flipped 1,000,000 times. The probability of it landing heads every single time is so close to zero that we'd never expect it to happen. And yet, there's nothing physically preventing such an outcome. If we repeated the experiment an astronomical number of times, a sequence of 1,000,000 heads would eventually occur. The paradox isn't in the result itself, but in the tension between expectation and reality, between what we believe to be impossible and what is simply improbable. This issue extends beyond gambling and probability theory. It manifests in real-world decision-making, existential risk, and even cosmology. Consider the origin of life. The odds of complex molecules randomly assembling into a self-replicating system may be extraordinarily low, yet life exists. Some argue this makes life's existence paradoxical. How can something so improbable be real? Others counter that improbable events are inevitable given enough opportunities. In a vast enough universe, even the rarest outcomes must eventually occur. The paradox also reveals a flaw in human reasoning. We are terrible at intuitively understanding large numbers and small probabilities. People consistently overestimate the likelihood of rare disasters like plane crashes or shark attacks while underestimating common risks like heart disease. In contrast, we assume that extremely low probabilities mean something will never happen, even though we know rare events must occur somewhere, sometime. This has unsettling implications for our perception of reality. If an event is so unlikely that we have no reason to believe it will occur, should we still prepare for it? Should we live as if the highly improbable is possible? The paradox suggests that dismissing rare events outright is a mistake because, eventually, the impossible happens. Philosophically, the paradox challenges the foundation of inductive reasoning, the idea that we can predict the future based on past experiences. We tend to assume that just because something is unlikely today, it will remain unlikely forever. But as the lottery paradox reminds us, unlikelihood does not mean impossibility. The moment the winning ticket is drawn, the impossible becomes real. How do we reconcile this paradox? Some argue that we should rethink our expectations. Instead of assuming that highly improbable events will never happen, we should accept that in a world of vast possibilities, the absurd is inevitable. Others take a more practical approach, acknowledging that while rare events do occur, they are not predictable enough to be useful in decision-making. But the tension remains. If logic tells us that the winner of a lottery should not expect to win, how do we explain the ticket in their hands? If the improbable is destined to happen, what else in our world, or in our lives, seems impossible today but will one day be undeniably real? The twin paradox, a pair of seemingly contradictory truths. The observer's paradox. The observer's paradox reveals a fascinating truth. When we direct our attention towards something, we inevitably change it. What we often assume is a neutral act, observation, is far from passive. In fact, the mere act of observing can alter behavior in ways that defy expectation and intuition. This paradox is a phenomenon that stretches across fields as diverse as physics, psychology, and sociology, revealing an unsettling reality. Pure, objective observation may be impossible. At its core, the paradox is simple. When we attempt to study a system, the very act of observing it can disrupt its natural state. This makes it impossible to know what would have happened had we not been watching. It's as though the universe resists our attempts to peek behind the curtain, rewriting the script in the process. One of the most famous examples of this paradox is found in quantum mechanics, where the nature of reality itself appears to depend on observation. Consider the double-slit experiment, one of the most baffling outcomes in modern physics. In this experiment, a beam of particles, such as electrons or photons, is fired at a barrier with two slits. If we do not observe which slit each particle passes through, they behave like waves, creating an interference pattern on a screen behind the slits. However, the moment we attempt to measure which slit the particle travels through, the wave-like behavior collapses, and the particles act like solid objects instead. In other words, simply attempting to observe the particle's path forces it to behave differently than it would have if left unobserved. This raises a profound question. Does reality exist in a definitive state before we observe it, or does our observation create it? As physicists delve deeper, the implications become more unsettling. Quantum mechanics suggests that observation is not just a passive act, but an active force that collapses possibilities into a single outcome. Yet, the observer's paradox isn't confined to the realm of physics. It also extends to human behavior, as seen in sociology and psychology. Known as the Hawthorne effect, people tend to alter their behavior when they know they are being observed. Early studies at the Western Electric Hawthorne Works in the 1920s revealed that factory workers' productivity increased simply because they were aware they were being studied. The presence of an observer changed their natural state, making it impossible to discern how they would have acted under normal circumstances. This effect permeates nearly every facet of human life. Surveillance alters behavior in public spaces. Political polling can influence election outcomes by shifting public opinion. Even in personal interactions, the awareness of being watched affects our decisions, speech, and self-perception. We don't merely exist, we perform under the watchful gaze of others. On a deeper level, the observer's paradox forces us to ask whether true objectivity is even possible. If reality shifts when we observe it, can we ever know what the world is like when we aren't looking? This paradox extends to philosophy, particularly in the discussions of consciousness and self-awareness. If every thought we have about ourselves shapes our perception of who we are, can we ever truly know ourselves in an unfiltered way? Or are we like the quantum particles in the double-slit experiment, constantly changing simply because we are aware of ourselves? The paradox challenges the very foundation of knowledge. Scientific inquiry assumes that we can study the universe without interfering with it. Yet time and again, we find that the act of observing is inextricably linked to what we observe. The closer we look, the more we distort what we seek to understand. Perhaps this paradox is a fundamental feature of reality itself. Perhaps the universe does not have a fixed state, but instead adapts and shifts in response to the conscious entities trying to measure it. If that's the case, the pursuit of objective truth may forever be constrained by the very minds that seek it. Russell's paradox. Some things follow rules so perfectly that they ultimately collapse under their own logic. Mathematics, the realm of precision and certainty, seems immune to contradiction until it isn't. Deep within the foundations of set theory, where numbers and objects are categorized with absolute rigor, one simple question shreds logic itself. If a set is defined as the collection of things that fit a particular rule, can a set contain itself? And if not, what happens when we try to define a set of all sets that do not contain themselves? This is Russell's paradox, a devastating logical contradiction discovered by British philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell in 1901. The paradox is simple to state, but its implications are destructive, exposing cracks in the very foundation of mathematics. To grasp the issue, consider a collection of books. A library contains books about various topics: history, science, philosophy. But imagine a new category: books that reference themselves. A book titled The Complete History of This Book belongs in this category because it describes itself. A book about physics does not reference itself, so it belongs in a different category: books that do not reference themselves. Now apply this logic to sets. A set is just a collection of objects defined by some common property. There are sets of numbers, sets of shapes, even sets of sets. But what happens if we define a new set, the set of all sets that do not contain themselves? Let's call this set R. This is where the paradox emerges. Does R contain itself? If it does, then by definition, it should not be in the set, because R is only supposed to include sets that do not contain themselves. But if R does not contain itself, then by its own rule, it should be included in the set. It is both inside and outside of itself at the same time. Logic collapses, and the contradiction is unavoidable. Russell's discovery sent shockwaves through the world of mathematics and philosophy. The paradox revealed that set theory, the system designed to categorize everything with absolute precision, contained a fatal flaw. If sets could be defined without restriction, contradictions could arise that destroy consistency. Mathematics, the supposed bastion of truth, was suddenly a house of cards built on unstable ground. This paradox was more than a curiosity. It threatened the very foundations of logic. Mathematicians had relied on set theory as the bedrock of their discipline, and now that bedrock was crumbling. If sets could generate contradictions, how could mathematics ever be trusted? Russell's paradox forced an urgent reevaluation of mathematical foundations. Some sought to eliminate paradoxes by imposing stricter rules on set formation, leading to formal systems like Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, which restricted how sets could be defined. Others attempted to redefine logic itself, introducing hierarchical structures that prevented self-referential loops. The paradox even influenced Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which later proved that any sufficiently complex mathematical system will always contain true statements that cannot be proven within the system, another profound limitation on absolute certainty. Beyond mathematics, the paradox raises unsettling questions about language, self-reference, and the limits of human understanding. If logic itself can create loops that break reality, what other paradoxes might lurk beneath the surface of what we consider rational thought? The paradox of self-reference extends beyond math into philosophy, psychology, and even artificial intelligence. Can a system fully define itself, or does every attempt to categorize the world inevitably lead to contradictions? Russell's paradox is not just an anomaly, it is a warning. It reveals that even in our most precise, carefully constructed systems, contradictions may lie beneath the surface, waiting to tear everything apart. And if the very foundation of logic can contain a paradox, what does that say about our ability to truly understand reality? The observer's paradox. Reality is not a passive landscape waiting to be understood. It is an active, intricate system where even the smallest flaw can unravel the threads of certainty. The Sorite's paradox. The question of when a heap of sand ceases to be a heap may seem trivial, but it reveals deep philosophical issues. If a collection of sand grains isn't a heap, what happens when you add one more grain? It still isn't a heap. Keep adding, and at what point does it become one? This transition is impossible to pinpoint, yet undeniably, a heap exists. Now, reverse the process. Start with a heap and remove one grain at a time. When does it stop being a heap? If no precise moment exists where the change occurs, then can a heap ever truly exist? This is the Sorite's paradox, a deceptively simple problem that exposes the ambiguity in how we categorize the world. It's a paradox of vagueness, highlighting the difficulties in defining boundaries, numbers, and categories. The paradox doesn't apply only to sand. It's relevant to identity, morality, and even reality itself. At its heart, it reflects the problem of a continuum. One state gradually morphs into another without a clear dividing line. Consider a person slowly going bald. Losing one hair doesn't make them bald, and losing two still doesn't. Yet, at some point, they are undeniably bald. The same issue arises in defining old age, wealth, intelligence, or even consciousness. When does a child become an adult? When does a developing mind become self-aware? How many molecules can you remove from a chair before it ceases to be a chair? If no single change is definitive, do these categories truly hold any meaning? The Sorite's paradox traces back to the ancient Greek philosopher Eubulides, who crafted it to challenge the assumptions behind logic and language. Strict logic demands clear distinctions. Something is either true or false, X or not X. But the paradox shows that reality often resists such neat classifications. Categories that seem precise break down under scrutiny, revealing their inherent fuzziness. Philosophers and logicians have proposed various solutions. One approach is to accept that categories like heap or bald are inherently vague, leading to the development of fuzzy logic. In this system, truth exists on a spectrum, not as a binary. Instead of saying someone is simply bald or not bald, fuzzy logic assigns a degree of baldness, a percentage, which mirrors how humans naturally perceive such concepts. Yet this doesn't resolve the deeper question: where exactly do we draw the line, and does such a line even exist? Another approach rejects the need for precise definitions altogether. Some argue that just because we can't pinpoint an exact boundary doesn't mean the concept is meaningless. A heap of sand exists even if its definition is flexible. However, this raises an unsettling issue. If boundaries are arbitrary, how can we justify any classification? If we accept this vagueness in everyday language, does it also extend to ethics, identity, and truth itself? Consider morality. If one small unethical act doesn't matter, then neither does the next and the next. But at what point does this small wrongdoing cross the threshold into full-scale corruption? The same logic applies to personal identity. You're not the same person you were 10 years ago. Your thoughts, experiences, and even the molecules in your body have changed. Yet, at no single moment did you cease to exist and become someone else. If personal identity is as vague as a heap of sand, then what truly defines the self? The Sorite's paradox doesn't just expose the limitations of language, it calls into question the very way we construct reality. If our understanding of existence relies on boundaries that don't actually exist, how stable is our perception of the world? It suggests that many concepts we take for granted, identities, truths, categories, may be built on foundations that are inherently undefined. So, does a heap of sand exist? Is there such a thing as baldness? Are we the same person we were yesterday? The Sorites paradox doesn't provide an answer. Instead, it forces us to confront the unsettling possibility that reality may not be as neatly divided as we like to believe. If much of what we consider real is built on arbitrary distinctions, what else in our world might be nothing more than an illusion of certainty? The omnipotence paradox. The question of whether an all-powerful being can create a rock so heavy that even they cannot lift it may seem simplistic, even childish, in its phrasing. Yet, this paradox cuts to the core of an ancient contradiction. If such a being can create the rock, it suggests there is something they cannot do: lift it. On the other hand, if they cannot create the rock, then their power is already limited. Either way, omnipotence appears to unravel. This is the omnipotence paradox, a dilemma that challenges the very idea of unlimited power. At first glance, omnipotence seems to imply absolute power, the ability to do anything without limitation. But when scrutinized, cracks begin to appear. If omnipotence is truly limitless, it must include the ability to limit itself. However, if an omnipotent being can impose limits on its own power, it ceases to be omnipotent. The paradox raises a fundamental question. Can infinite power contain itself, or must it inevitably collapse under its own weight? This dilemma has deep roots in the history of philosophy and theology. Medieval scholars wrestled with defining divine omnipotence in a way that avoided logical inconsistencies. The core issue lies in whether omnipotence should be understood as the ability to do anything imaginable or only the ability to do what is logically possible. If omnipotence includes the ability to perform the logically impossible, such as creating a square circle or making 2 + 2 = 5, then it becomes a meaningless concept, one that defies reason. Philosophers like Thomas Aquinas proposed a solution. Omnipotence does not include the power to perform logically contradictory actions. Under this view, asking whether an omnipotent being can create a rock too heavy to lift is akin to asking if they can make an illogical statement true. The paradox, then, might not be a genuine problem, but a linguistic misunderstanding of what omnipotence truly means. However, does this resolution truly solve the issue, or does it simply redefine omnipotence to sidestep the paradox? Another interpretation suggests that omnipotence is not an absolute state, but a dynamic one. A being might have the ability to do anything possible at a given moment, but if they choose to limit themselves, this limitation does not contradict their power. It is an expression of it. In this way, omnipotence could be seen as a flexible concept that allows self-imposed restrictions without diminishing its fundamental nature. But this raises further questions. If an omnipotent being can restrict itself, can it undo those restrictions? And if it cannot, is it still truly omnipotent? The implications of the omnipotence paradox extend beyond theology. It forces us to question the very nature of power. Can any system, being, or force ever be truly limitless? Even in physics, constraints emerge naturally. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, motion follows precise laws, and causality enforces an order upon events. If omnipotence is impossible in theory, does that suggest no force, however vast, can ever escape the fundamental boundaries of logic? The paradox also mirrors patterns in human history. Rulers, empires, and ideologies that sought absolute control often found themselves bound by contradictions of their own making. The more power they accumulated, the more resistance they encountered. The more they tried to control, the more unstable they became. If omnipotence is self-defeating, then perhaps every pursuit of ultimate power is doomed to unravel under its own weight. Ultimately, the omnipotence paradox isn't just about gods, rocks, or divine power. It's about the tension between possibility and impossibility, the recognition that no force, be it natural, supernatural, or theoretical, can escape the fundamental constraints of existence. And if even the concept of limitless power collapses under scrutiny, what does that say about the very structure of reality itself? The omnipotence paradox, like a single grain of sand, reveals the intricate complexities of existence. The grandfather paradox. Imagine stepping into a time machine, the hum of hidden energy vibrating through its metallic walls. Before you, the path unfolds like an open book, waiting to be rewritten. But what happens if, in your journey backward, you commit the unthinkable, erasing your own lineage before it even begins? Could you still exist to make that choice? Or have you created an impossible contradiction that defies the very nature of time itself? The grandfather paradox is one of the most famous problems in time travel philosophy, a logical knot that tightens the moment you attempt to unravel it. Suppose you travel back in time and prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother. If you succeed, one of your parents is never born, which means you are never born either. But if you were never born, how could you have traveled back in time in the first place? The paradox loops endlessly, spiraling into absurdity. Though the contradiction may seem straightforward, its implications go far beyond a mere thought experiment. If time travel to the past were possible, it would shatter the principle of causality, the idea that every effect has a cause. The very foundation of logic and physics could crumble under the weight of an action that erases its own cause. And yet, the idea of time loops, altered histories, and self-negating events has captivated philosophers and scientists alike. One possible resolution to the paradox is that nature itself prevents such contradictions. This concept, known as the Novikov self-consistency principle, suggests that time may operate in a way that avoids paradoxes altogether. If you travel to the past, you could still interact with events, but only in ways that preserve the future that led you there. Any attempt to alter history would be subtly corrected, ensuring the same outcome. Perhaps a series of chance accidents would prevent you from meeting your grandfather or ensure that your actions somehow lead to his fate remaining unchanged. However, what if the universe is less rigid? Some theories propose that every action creates a branching timeline, meaning that if you were to alter the past, you wouldn't erase your own existence. Instead, you would create a separate reality where you never existed. The many-worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics suggests that parallel timelines constantly diverge from every possible choice. This means that your trip to the past wouldn't change the reality you left, but would spawn an alternate history where a version of you never came to be. This introduces even more unsettling questions. If infinite timelines exist, does that mean every possible version of events has already played out somewhere? Are there countless versions of you, each navigating their own fate, unable to alter the path of another? Or do timelines collapse into one, leaving only a single, stable history? Some theorists argue that time might not be a simple sequence of events at all but an illusion, with all moments, past, present, and future, existing simultaneously. The block universe theory proposes that time is a landscape where traveling backward wouldn't allow you to rewrite reality, but merely to observe a fixed past, like walking through a museum of frozen moments. Still, the paradox endures. If the past is set in stone, does that mean free will is an illusion? If multiple timelines exist, does every choice spawn infinite new realities? If contradictions must be avoided, does that mean time itself is self-correcting? The grandfather paradox sits at the core of these mysteries, an unresolved enigma that pushes the limits of what we think we understand about reality. For now, time travel to the past remains confined to fiction, bound by the constraints of relativity and causality. But if the day ever comes when a machine can transport someone backward through history, one question will remain. Will they be a traveler, an observer, or a paradox waiting to happen? The quantum immortality paradox. Imagine a gun aimed at your head, connected to a quantum device that measures the spin of a subatomic particle. If the particle spins one way, the gun fires. If it spins another, the gun does nothing. Every time the trigger is pulled, the gun never goes off. No matter how many times the experiment runs, you always find yourself in the universe where you survive. This is the unsettling idea behind quantum immortality, a thought experiment linked to the many worlds interpretation in WI of quantum mechanics. According to this concept, as long as there is a possible reality where you continue to exist, you will always experience that branch of reality, never the one where you die. From an external perspective, the experimenter might see the gun fire in half of all universes, causing many versions of you to perish instantly. But for the conscious observer, the one experiencing reality firsthand, Death only happens to the other versions of you, never the one observing. This concept extends from Schrödinger's cat paradox, where a cat in a box exists in a superposition of both alive and dead states until observed. The many worlds interpretation takes this further. Instead of the wave function collapsing into one outcome, reality itself splits. The cat is alive in one universe and dead in another, both realities existing simultaneously. When applied to a human observer, the implications are even stranger. If consciousness follows the path where survival is possible, does that mean death is always something that happens to other versions of yourself? Could it be that an individual experiences a form of subjective immortality, never encountering their own death, but instead waking up in increasingly improbable realities where they somehow persist? This doesn't mean avoiding aging or misfortune. It means that, no matter the odds, you always find yourself in the version of events where you survive. The universe, by sheer probability, conspires to ensure your continued existence. At first glance, this may seem absurd. We witness death all around us, an inevitable part of life. But have you ever truly experienced the moment of your own death? You have no memory of ceasing to be, only of continuing. Quantum immortality suggests this pattern will never stop. Even if it requires the most improbable chain of events, miraculous recoveries, freak accidents that should have killed you, or bizarre cosmic coincidences, you will always find yourself in the reality where you're still alive. But what kind of existence would this be? Imagine you're on the brink of death, hooked up to life support in a hospital, barely holding on. If quantum immortality holds, then, even in the most desperate of conditions, there will always be one timeline, however improbable, where you linger on. Consciousness persists, no matter how frail your body becomes. The nightmare scenario arises. What if you don't continue in a healthy state, but in an unrecognizably damaged, decaying form, trapped in an endless cycle of deterioration with no release? On the flip side, while quantum immortality ensures that you never experience your own death, it does nothing to stop the loss of others. You will continue to live, but those around you will disappear, one by one. The world will shift, timelines will diverge, but each version of reality will be marked by the gradual erasure of familiar faces. Of course, this entire idea depends on the validity of the many worlds interpretation. If the universe doesn't split with every quantum event, and if wave functions collapse into one outcome instead of branching into alternate realities, then quantum immortality doesn't hold. In that case, death would remain final, just as we've always believed. But if the many worlds interpretation is true, and every possibility plays out somewhere, then in at least one version of reality, your story never ends. You simply continue, always surviving, always waking up to another day, even when the odds dictate otherwise. And if that's true, the question is no longer whether you'll live forever, but how long you'll endure before you wish you didn't. The ship of Theseus paradox. The ship of Theseus paradox has intrigued thinkers for generations. Over time, the ship's wooden planks begin to rot and deteriorate. Piece by piece, they are replaced. First the mast, then the sails, and eventually entire sections of the hull. Decades pass, and every single part of the ship is replaced with new materials. This raises a fundamental question that philosophers have debated for over 2,000 years. Is it still the same ship? This is the essence of the ship of Theseus paradox, a thought experiment that challenges our understanding of identity, continuity, and change. First recorded by the Greek historian Plutarch in the 1st century AD, the puzzle asks, if every part of an object is replaced, is it still the same object, or has it become something entirely different? At first, the answer seems obvious. Of course, it's still Theseus's ship. The repairs were gradual, and at no point did it suddenly stop being the same ship. However, the paradox doesn't stop there. Imagine that every plank removed from the original ship is carefully preserved and reassembled elsewhere. Over time, a second ship is created, identical to the original in every way, made from the original materials. Now, we have two ships, one composed of entirely new parts, but continually maintained, and the other made from the original planks, reassembled in the same shape. Which one is the true ship of Theseus? Some argue that the ship in the harbor is the original because it never ceased to exist, and its identity and function were preserved. Others claim that the reassembled ship, made from the original materials, is the true ship of Theseus. After all, if you saw a person gradually fade away and another appear with their exact body parts, wouldn't you assume the second person was the same as the first? This paradox grips us because both answers seem valid, yet they contradict one another. At its core, the ship of Theseus paradox raises profound questions about what it means for something to remain itself over time. This isn't just a puzzle about ships, it extends to everything, including you. Every cell in your body is constantly dying and being replaced. Over several years, nearly all the atoms that make up your body are swapped out. Are you still the same person you were a decade ago? If the answer is yes, what exactly makes you you? Is it your physical matter, or is it your memories, consciousness, and continuity of experience? Neuroscientists and philosophers debate whether personal identity is tied to physical continuity or the persistence of thought. Some argue that a person is not defined by their body, but by a pattern of information, by the continuity of memory and self-awareness, rather than by a specific collection of molecules. The ship of Theseus paradox isn't just an ancient puzzle. It has practical implications in fields such as law, medicine, artificial intelligence, and physics. Consider organ transplants, synthetic limb replacements, or even the futuristic idea of uploading consciousness into a machine. When does a person stop being themselves after multiple alterations? Similarly, a company may replace all its employees, change its leadership, and rebuild its offices, yet still claim to be the same organization. But if every defining feature has changed, is it truly the same entity? In the realm of artificial intelligence, the paradox is even more relevant. If an AI system undergoes continuous upgrades, replacing every line of its original code while retaining its function, is it still the same intelligence? There is no single answer to the ship of Theseus paradox. Some suggest that identity is not absolute but a fluid, evolving concept. Things don't have a single, true essence, but rather a shifting continuity that we recognize. Others argue that identity is simply an illusion we impose on an ever-changing reality to make sense of the world. Whether applied to ancient ships, human consciousness, or the future of artificial intelligence, one thing remains clear: everything changes. And in a world where nothing remains the same forever, what does it truly mean to exist? The liar paradox. The liar paradox begins with a seemingly simple statement. Nothing complex or elaborate, just 4 words. This statement is false. You pause, rereading it. Something feels off. If the statement is true, then it must be false. But if it's false, it must be true. Welcome to the liar paradox, a timeless riddle that resists resolution. It's a sentence that should be easily classified as true or false. But the moment you try, you're sucked into an infinite loop of contradiction. The paradox dates back to at least the 4th century BCE, attributed to Eubulides of Miletus, a Greek philosopher known for his self-referential puzzles. His original version was simple: a man says he is lying. If he's lying, then he must be telling the truth. But if he's telling the truth, then he's lying. At first glance, this may seem like mere wordplay, but the implications run deep. The liar paradox exposes flaws in the very foundations of logic. It creates a fault line that mathematicians, philosophers, and computer scientists have struggled to resolve. It might seem like a clever trick. Perhaps we should just dismiss it as nonsense. But logic doesn't work that way. Every sentence must be either true or false. No exceptions. The liar paradox breaks this rule, creating a statement that defies classification yet undeniably exists. One way to sidestep the paradox is by suggesting that truth and falsehood aren't the only possibilities. Some logicians propose a concept of truth gaps, where a statement is neither true nor false. Others suggest truth gluts, where a statement is both true and false simultaneously. Neither solution is entirely satisfactory. If logic permits statements that are both true and false, can we trust any logical system at all? For much of history, paradoxes like this were intellectual curiosities. But in the early 20th century, they erupted into a full-blown crisis. Bertrand Russell, one of the greatest logicians, discovered that self-referential paradoxes like the liar paradox were not just fun puzzles. They were undermining the foundations of mathematics. His discovery forced mathematicians into an existential crisis. What if all of mathematics was built on unstable ground? The response to this revelation was a radical shift in our understanding of logic, leading to new systems that sought to contain, rather than resolve, paradoxes. Mathematicians like Kurt Gödel went even further, proving that some truths are inherently beyond our reach, and that even the most robust logical systems contain statements that can never be proven. The liar paradox doesn't just threaten mathematics. It also haunts computer science, linguistics, and even artificial intelligence. Any system that relies on logic must confront the issue of self-reference. If a machine encounters a version of the liar paradox, what should it do? Some AI researchers worry that self-referential loops could cause AI systems to freeze, crash, or generate unpredictable outcomes. If a machine is programmed to analyze truth but encounters a statement that resists categorization, how should it respond? Beyond AI, the paradox infiltrates philosophy and epistemology, the study of knowledge itself. If we can't even define truth and falsehood with absolute certainty, how can we trust any statement at all? The liar paradox is more than just an intellectual puzzle. It's a crack in the very structure of thought. It challenges the basic assumption that language and logic can map onto reality in a consistent way. If something as simple as a single sentence can unravel our system of reasoning, what else might lie beneath the surface of our understanding, waiting to dismantle everything we believe to be true? And so, the liar paradox endures, a puzzle with no easy solution, challenging our most fundamental ideas about logic, truth, and reality itself. Zeno's paradoxes. Imagine you're at the starting line, ready to cross a room. The distance is short, just 10 steps. You take your first step, then another. But what if someone told you that reaching the other side was logically impossible? Welcome to the strange world of Zeno's paradoxes, a series of ancient thought experiments that challenge the very concept of motion. Over 2,000 years ago, the Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea proposed these paradoxes to support a shocking claim: movement is an illusion. One of the most famous paradoxes is the story of Achilles and the tortoise. Picture the legendary Greek warrior Achilles, the fastest runner of his time, racing against a slow-moving tortoise. To make it fair, the tortoise is given a head start. As Achilles begins running, he quickly reaches the point where the tortoise was, but by then, the tortoise has moved a little farther ahead. Achilles reaches the new spot, but by the time he arrives, the tortoise has moved forward again. This continues endlessly. Each time Achilles reaches the tortoise's previous position, the tortoise has moved ahead. If Achilles must pass an infinite number of points where the tortoise was, how can he ever overtake it? Another version, the dichotomy paradox, follows similar reasoning. Before you can walk across a room, you must first cover half the distance. Then, half of what remains. Then half of that, and so on. Since this process continues forever, it seems you should never complete your journey. How can you move at all if you must first take an infinite number of steps? Zeno's argument seems airtight. The logic is flawless, yet the conclusion feels absurd. We know that Achilles will overtake the tortoise. We know we can cross the room. So what went wrong? For centuries, philosophers and mathematicians wrestled with Zeno's paradoxes. Some dismissed them as mere word games, while others saw them as serious challenges to our understanding of reality. These paradoxes raise a deeper question. Is motion real, or is it merely an illusion created by our minds? The key to resolving Zeno's paradoxes lies in the concept of infinity. The mistake isn't assuming that an infinite number of tasks must take an infinite amount of time. In reality, the infinite sequence of smaller and smaller steps converges to a finite sum. This realization came with the development of calculus, particularly through the work of Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, which provided a solution. The concept of limits showed that an infinite number of steps can add up to a finite result. So, Achilles does pass the tortoise, and you can cross the room. Motion is possible, even in a world where infinity lurks at every step. However, some remain unsettled. If movement is simply a series of infinite divisions, does reality flow continuously? Or is it made up of discrete frames, individual moments frozen in time? Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that the universe itself may not be smooth, but instead composed of indivisible units at the smallest scales. In this case, Zeno might have stumbled upon something far deeper than he ever realized. Zeno's paradoxes serve as a reminder that even the most ordinary experiences, walking, running, moving, contain mysteries that challenge our understanding of reality. Is motion just an illusion of perception? Are we living in a universe where change is merely a mathematical construct rather than a physical truth? And if we can question something as fundamental as movement, what else might turn out to be an illusion? The paradox of the unexpected hanging. A prisoner sits in his dimly lit cell, awaiting his fate. The warden arrives with a chilling announcement. You will be hanged at noon on a weekday next week. However, the execution will come as a surprise. When the hangman arrives, you will not see it coming. The prisoner, a man of sharp logic, begins to dissect the warden's statement. He reasons that if he can predict the day of his execution, it cannot happen, as the warden's condition of surprise would be violated. The prisoner starts by eliminating possibilities, beginning with Friday. If he is still alive by Thursday night, then Friday must be the day. But if he knows this, then the execution wouldn't be a surprise, and Friday is ruled out. With Friday gone, Thursday becomes the last remaining option. If he survives Wednesday night, Thursday would be the day, which would also violate the surprise condition. Thus, Thursday is impossible. The prisoner continues this process backward, eliminating Wednesday, Tuesday, and finally Monday. By the end of his analysis, he is convinced that his execution cannot logically occur at all. Satisfied with his reasoning, he leans back against the cold stone wall, confident that he has escaped his fate. Yet, come Wednesday at noon, the hangman arrives. The prisoner is dragged to the gallows, completely blindsided. The warden's decree is fulfilled, and the execution is both inevitable and a complete surprise. This is the paradox of the unexpected hanging, a riddle that warps reason into contradiction. The prisoner's mistake was assuming that logic could dictate reality. Paradoxically, his very reasoning, his certainty that he could predict the outcome, ensured his surprise. This paradox manifests in various forms. In academia, it takes the shape of the surprise exam paradox. A professor informs students that there will be a pop quiz next week, but they won't know the day. The students, reasoning like the prisoner, attempt to deduce that the test can't happen, only to be shocked when the quiz is handed out midweek. This paradox plays out in the real world time and time again as people attempt to predict the unpredictable, only to be caught off guard when things unfold differently. The paradox has deeper implications. It challenges the reliability of logic itself. The prisoner's reasoning was flawless in isolation. Each step followed logically. Yet the final conclusion was entirely wrong. How can flawless reasoning lead to a false outcome? This suggests something unsettling about certainty. The more convinced we are that we can predict the future, the more vulnerable we become to unexpected events. Just because something seems impossible on paper does not mean that reality will follow those constraints. This paradox raises a larger question. Can surprise and certainty coexist? If an event is guaranteed to happen, does it lose its ability to surprise us? And if we assume we can always predict what will happen next, do we set ourselves up for greater shocks when reality defies our expectations? Perhaps the true warning of the paradox is this. The most dangerous surprises are those we believe we have ruled out entirely. The bootstrap paradox. Imagine a book with no title or author appearing mysteriously on your desk. As you flip through its pages, you discover it holds profound knowledge, secrets of the universe, advanced mathematics, centuries ahead of its time. Driven by curiosity, you begin studying it, mastering its contents over the years. Eventually, you decide that the world must see this incredible knowledge, so you publish the book yourself. It spreads, passed down through generations, until, centuries later, a worn copy finds its way back to you. The very same book you once discovered. The question is, who wrote it? This is the bootstrap paradox, a time loop where something exists without an origin. A piece of information, an object, or even a person seems to emerge from nowhere, circulating through time in a cycle without a clear point of creation. Unlike other time paradoxes that involve altering the past, the bootstrap paradox suggests that something can exist without ever being created. Take, for example, a violinist who travels back in time and teaches their younger self how to play. The younger version grows up, becomes the same violinist, and eventually travels back to teach their past self, creating a continuous loop. But if no one outside this loop ever taught them, where did their knowledge of playing the violin originally come from? It has no true beginning. It simply exists in an endless cycle, defying our understanding of causality. The term bootstrap paradox comes from the phrase, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, an impossible act of self-creation. This paradox often appears in science fiction, such as when a person receives a blueprint for a futuristic machine, builds it, and then travels back to give that same blueprint to their past self. The machine exists, it works, but who actually designed it? If the knowledge always existed within the loop, there's no definitive creator. Physics doesn't completely rule out the possibility of bootstrap paradoxes, especially in theoretical models of time travel. In a universe where closed time loops exist, events could sustain themselves without an initial cause. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics even suggest that information could be preserved across time in ways we don't yet fully understand. If this paradox is possible, then some of the most fundamental truths we take for granted might not be as certain as we think. After all, if a book, a violinist, or a machine can exist without a creator, who's to say that the universe itself didn't emerge in the same way? Thanks for watching video.